All right, I am now joined once again by Gordon Katic, uh, Ethan the surnameless, and Victor Bruzzone, uh, who to complete our breakdown of the Munk debate in Toronto on mainstream media, hitting Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray against Michelle Goldberg and Malcolm Gladwell. How's everybody doing today?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Excited for the conclusion to this. Want to really get to the bottom of whether or not journalists are lizard people or pedophiles or both. We shall see.
Ooh, that P word could get us banned. Careful.
Yeah, no, those are the options as I understand it in the debate. Yes, yes, Body Anarchist, this is live. So, yeah, I should also say, apropos of nothing in particular, a couple things before we get started and actually watch the debate itself. First of all, thank you to everybody who came out to the GTAA / This Is Revolution meet and greet in Los Angeles on Tuesday. Had a great time. Have a bunch of pictures. We'll show some on the little reel with some of them on the show on Monday of everybody hanging around in Slash's booth at the Rainbow Room and posing in front of the statue of Lemmy from Motorhead and stuff. So that was all fun. Also, just wanted to do a quick shout out while I was thinking about it to our I almost said our absent friend Matt McManus, but that makes him sound like he's dead and not just not on this particular stream. But our friend who's currently absent, Matt McManus, who has a great article out in Ario magazine today that I read just a little bit before the stream. It's called Marxist Professors and Brainwashed Students. It's a review of Charles Kirk's latest tome, the College Scam, which Charlie is talking about how universities are left-wing indoctrination factories and shouldn't go to college. And I don't know. I have to say, reading this review of his book and based on my own experiences with him, look, not that everybody has to, but I think there's some stuff to be said for going to college. I think you can learn some stuff and it'll be useful to you, and you won't say some of the things that you won't say some of the things that Charlie Kirk ends up saying. I think good college.
So Matt loved the book, I assume.
Yeah. Well, here I've got the screen share. I'll scroll down to spoiler. I'm going to give away the grand finale at the end. Here we go. So he says at the end of the review that. Oh, yeah, I love this quote from the book, by the way. Where did Anthony Fauci acquire the medical authority and credibility to impose a lockdown in America and arguably mislead the public? I love that arguably, like at the last second, College. Where did Somali-born Ilhan Omar hate the country and saved her from the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya? College. Where did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez learn that America must be bankrupted and evidently obliterated from within? College, and on and on and on.
Oh my God.
But yes, I will give away the ending. The final paragraph says that The College Scam is the worst book I've read this year, and although the year is still young, I am doubtful that I will encounter an even worse one.
Never say never.
Somehow Kirk has managed to limbo dance below the low bar set by his previous book, The MAGA Doctrine, which I reviewed for Ario. Yeah. I love that he reads all this shit. And then he says some more earnest stuff after that. But yeah, Good stuff. Go read that.
If only college was
worst.
actually like they described, but
I know, right?
yeah. But Ben, as a well-documented college Marxist indoctrinator, do you have any tips? Because I'd love to become one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I do is I teach classes about like symbolic logic and probability theory and stuff, and I just hope that they catch the Marxist indoctrination that's like very subtle implication going on, like between the crevices of those other subjects. Yeah, I would love it. I mean, I have to say it's changed a little bit in like the last several years since the basically post Bernie, since there's obviously the left in general is not quite as tiny and marginal as it was, but I have to say, like, my experience with universities prior to 2015 was that everybody was like either kind of apolitical or just like a regular ass liberal. Like I don't I don't know, as an actual as like an actual radical Marxist, blah 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 blah, right? Like I'd always I was sort of pined when I heard this stuff that made me sad that I never felt like I had as much company as people portrayed me as having.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think this kind of myth on the conservative side about how many Marxists are in academia. I mean, on the one hand, we were kind of talking about this on Twitter DMs before, Ben, but like, I think everyone just seems to be mostly just kind of like a center left liberal and maybe what would be considered like a far left liberal. Like even in my department at the University of Toronto, which is a political science department, we literally don't have any actual like bread and butter Marxists. Like we have people who do critical theory. We have people who obviously look at the history of political thought, but there's actually like not that many actual Marxists. So I think it's true. Like, so it's not really true what the conservatives say, but on the other hand, it's also the conservatives are right that to actually find a conservative who would like vote Republican, for example,
right,
is extremely rare. Like, I don't know, even in my department, for those who don't know, like the political science department at the University of Toronto kind of has a history of being associated with the Straussians because Alan Bloom taught in my department in the 70s for pretty much all of the 70s. And, there's a guy, Clifford Orwin, who's probably like the only one who's still kind of faithful to Strauss. And as far as I know, even he'll say he votes Democrat. Like, so it's just like, it would be so hard to find, I think, someone who's actually like a Republican.
Maybe like economics departments, like perhaps, you'll find some there, although it's like also complicated because I think there are people have like much less liberal views about economics, but they're still broadly progressive on cultural issues. So, they, which is not like actually that shocking or interesting. I think that it's very common to find like whole professions that have like a sort of collective partisan lean, one way or the other, because just like cultural and geographical and et cetera, like educational, tilts. So, I think it's like not surprising that like broadly speaking, people who, there are industries where most people who work there are Republicans, and higher education is one where most people who work there are Democrats, both because of sort of more cosmopolitan, sort of cultural milieu, and also because Republicans have been using them as a punching bag forever, so it like makes it harder to. It's like I always figured that if in a world where the United States had a conservative party that hadn't been like doing the Southern strategy stuff since the 1960s, right, there would be like way, way more Black people who voted for that conservative party just on the basis of like overall political worldview, right? It's just that like, yeah, if you're going to like aggressively lead into, sort of white resentment and identity politics, then like obviously that's gonna limit your, potential electoral gains in that demographic.
I think one of the funny things about this discourse is anyone who actually spends any time in college and is a Marxist or comes across one of the rare Marxists in their department or somewhere else in their orbit will find out quickly that they're kind of an aggrieved minority. Like to Victor's point, there just aren't that many of them. And like after a drink or two, they start to have similar complaints about like the culture of academia, its elitism, its lack of materialist analysis, its sort of disconnect from all sorts of structures of power and oppression, and its sort of posturing. I think those critiques coming from the left are more sophisticated than the critiques coming from the right. And we tend to kind of like be more quiet about it because we don't want to look like we're kind of in bed with those people. But those critiques are there. I mean, people on the pages of Jacobin would make them sort of all the time.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like a funny thing how like, because it's pretty obvious, like if you go to your average college, like you're gonna find people on the left, but mostly it's people who are interested in like defund the police and like let trans people use the bathroom and stuff like that. Like there's very few people talking about like the primacy of the productive forces or whatever, so like,
yeah.
And so I think like in order to sort of maintain the colleges are Marxist charge, like the new line is just like, well, they're cultural Marxists or they're race Marxists, which is just like has nothing to do with Marxism, but you get to still use the word. So,
Yeah, I would almost say that, at least from my anecdotal experience, the person who seems to influence more people who nominally self-describe themselves on the left than Marx is like Foucault. I feel like Foucault influences, like, I would say like academia is somewhat dominated more by Foucauldians, I would say, than Marxists in a way.
Yeah, and also like I know that there's a sort of complicated conversation that people have about what was and wasn't true about Foucault's politics at various stages of his life, and I don't really want to weigh in on that, but like I would argue that regardless of what his sort of personal opinions were, there is actually like a pretty deep affinity between that Foucaultish way of looking at the world and just kind of progressive neoliberalism, that those actually like fit really well.
Totally. I even think there's some pretty reactionary ways of reading Foucault as well, but we don't need to get into that. So, but yeah, I agree.
Well, I mean, yeah, just like, it's sort of, if everything is power and oppression, kind of nothing is, and it's all very individualistic, and but yes, as you say, Ethan, you're not going to find a lot of people talk about the primacy of productive forces. Honestly, you find remarkably few people talking about raising the fucking minimum wage, like in colleges in general,
or like encouraging their students to unionize, even.
Yeah, right, totally, right. Yeah. Also, I want to thank the person in the chat who complained about my microphone, which made me realize that I actually didn't have it plugged in, so I was just using the internal mic.
That makes a lot more sense.
It's like, oh man, this is a pretty nice microphone. Why are they giving me shit? Oh, right, okay, fair enough.
So that might have been the case last week too, maybe. I don't know, because I remember people were kind of complaining about that, or that might have been because you were at your friend's house or something.
Yeah, last week I was at. Last week I was actually at our live show producer Jordan's apartment, and so I was just using whatever she had. Although that looked okay, but anyway, whatever. That's but we're not here to talk about universities. We're here to talk about the other half of the Lizard People indoctrination program, which is the media. To pick up where we left off last time, we'd kind of just finished, the sort of main statements and the kind of initial round of responses. I actually very intentionally set this for, I think, if I'm not wrong, I think this is like 45 seconds before we left off. But I want, because like Malcolm Gladwell is about to say the most ridiculous thing that anybody said all night, and I kind of want to see him say it again, which is that Trump is not an obsession of the mainstream media.
All right,
but yeah, why don't we watch a little bit of this, and then we can talk about it.
Sounds good.
One last comment, and that is, I was most amused by the particular subjects that seem to have excited the imagination and outrage of the two of you. I'll just list them before I go in my last 19 seconds. Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, the Canadian truckers, ivermectin, Jordan Peterson, and then something about this thing in These aren't things driven by the mainstream media. These are obsessions of the non-mainstream media. Once again, work it out, guys.
Donald. This debate is going off, as they say. I love it. So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here, and I'm going to do another round of rebuttals, guys. I'm not going to interrupt this wonderful back and forth. So, Matt, this time you are going to get 3 minutes on the clock, and then I'll figure out whether the rest get 3 minutes or 2 minutes. But you go first. 3 minutes on the clock to rebut what you've just heard.
First of all, are you really saying that Trump's relationship with Russia wasn't not an obsession of mainstream media? It was basically the entire content of cable news for 3 years. There was almost, again, the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, we built our newsroom around one story, that story. The New York Times doesn't get much more mainstream than that, I don't think. Defining the mainstream media is simple. I talked before about a bifurcated system where we have essentially two politically homogenous audiences. We have Fox News and conservative media on one side. The mainstream media, roughly speaking, is the other side, right? That's what we mean when we talk about the mainstream media. And yes, as I said in my speech, the old system under Walter Cronkite had its flaws, but it did have its advantages as well. Making the effort to talk to everybody garnered more trust in the public. There was a reason why people trusted news people more 20 or 30 or 40 years ago than they do now. Now, when people meet someone from the New York Times or from the Washington Post or from MSNBC out in middle America, they don't talk to them. You cannot get, those interviews are very difficult to get now because people perceive those institutions to be not on their side. This is very different. I know this as a campaign reporter myself. I've watched over the years how this has changed. Once upon a time, I could interview for Rolling Stone Republicans with no problem. People loved it. They would always talk about how Dr. Hook was in the cover of Rolling Stone. But over the years, progressively, people became more reserved and they became more distrustful, and they should have been, because the media made more and more mistakes over those years. Think about the WMD episode. We talked about the haloed processes of the mainstream media. Everybody got this wrong. And not only did they get that wrong, after they got it wrong, they promoted all the people who were the most wrong and fired all the people who were the most right. Some of the people were never forgiven for getting that story right, and some of them are editing major magazines today for getting it wrong. So that people have a reason to distrust the media. Of course they do. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Let's continue with our rebuttals, but just for the sake of time and moving us through this debate, I'm going to go 2 minutes each for the remaining 3 rebuttals in this second round. So we'll set the clock to 2 minutes. And Michelle, you're up.
So I guess the point that I keep coming back to is that this critique of the mainstream media, and particularly this critique of the mainstream media as kind of ideologically blinkered, is itself, I think, rooted in a very simplistic and distorted view of what's happening both in politics and in the relationship between the media and politics. I mean, specifically the idea that there was nothing to the Trump-Russia story. And I don't want to go too deep in the weeds, but this is bananas. I mean, certainly the Mueller, people put too much hope, people who despise Trump put too much hope in that Mueller would bring him to justice. But what we've learned, I remember when this report first came down that there was kind of concern in the intelligence agencies about Trump's relationship with Russia. If we had at that moment known that Donald Trump's campaign asked Russia for help in asked Russia for help in the election, if we had known that Donald Trump was seeking to do a huge huge business deal in Moscow and seeking Putin's assistance, if we had known at that moment that his campaign manager, who before then had managed the campaign of pro-Russian candidates in Ukraine, if we had known that his campaign manager was passing intelligence to somebody who was believed to be a KGB agent, and if we had known that Russia then did hack and leak the emails of the Democratic candidate for president, we would have thought, well, this is an astonishing blockbuster. And so it's really much more complicated than that. Finally, about Club Q, nobody believes that he is non-binary. If they did, they would think that this was a fascinating story and would love to report it. The media loves counterintuitive stories more than it loves ideologically convenient stories. It's simply that everyone knew that he was trolling us when he said that. Thank you.
Okay, Douglas, let's have your second rebuttal.
Thank you. Would that they were still interested in that nuance, Michelle. Would that they were. Malcolm Gladwell said we need to define mainstream media. If we haven't, it's because I spoke to the organizers before this tonight saying, are we going to spend the whole of the debate debating what the mainstream media definition should be? And they assured me not. But we can do. Let me do it in shorthand. The mainstream media, in my view, would be, for instance, things like government-subsidized media that say what the government wants them to say. I would say that it was the legacy media, the newspapers we used to trust once and we don't trust anymore, the ones that used to be the papers of record and which have slowly descended into just partisan hackery of whatever their own particular peccadillos are that month. Malcolm, you did a little nasty jab there, I noticed, at Matt, by trying to pretend that Matt Taibbi is desperate for the era of white men in broadcasting. It takes a certain chutzpah to make that claim, but I don't see any reason why that is the case with Matt. I don't think that you are hankering desperately for a world of white news presenters. You never, we've only just met, but you didn't give off that vibe to me. And when Malcolm says you got to get your story right, guys, I know it's easy for a cheap laugh line, but I don't see why we do. We're two very different people with very different careers, interests, and much more. We've trodden very different paths across very wide swathes of this planet. And we don't need to get our story straight for you, or for this audience tonight, or be in lockstep. Differences of opinion, including on the same side, used to be cherished. I could do more, but I'll leave.
Thank you. Okay, let's get our last rebuttal here from Malcolm. 2 minutes. Take us away.
I was astonished to listen as Matt Taibbi doubled down on his defense of Walter Cronkite. I feel like there should be a giant picture of Walter Cronkite behind. And he said, the most incredible quote was, Walter Cronkite, the era of that era in journalism was distinguished by people, journalists, quote, making the effort to talk to everybody. Now, he's talking about the 1950s and 60s. I just wanted to make a short list of the people who were not spoken to by journalists in the 1950s and 60s. And you may want to add some, if I miss some, Black people, women, poor people, gay people, people with mildly left-wing views. I mean, words fail me when somebody, when it presented with a critique of his rather idiosyncratic position on Walter Cronkite, comes back and says, oh, no, there's more to my great love of this man. The other thing that struck me in their comments was there's a weird obsession with the two of them with the notion that the media occasionally gets things wrong. And I wonder if they have confused the role of journalists with that of stockbrokers. Stockbrokers have to get their predictions right, but journalists don't. The job of a journalist is to use that famous phrase, to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And sometimes that means you go down some dead ends and you chase stories that don't turn out as you want them or wish them or hope that they would turn out. But that is the nature of the business. And if that business seems uncomfortable to you, then I would suggest you should go into stockbroking.
All right. Well, my main thought is that I think every time I hear from Gladwell, I like Walter Cronkite a little bit more. But what's what do you guys what do you guys think about the various claims and counterclaims that were made in this round?
I guess. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Victor.
I was just going to say, I think there's something to the idea that I think maybe Michelle Goldberg was talking about, that the media, it's probably easier to understand the media as being attracted to sensationalism than like naked ideology. I think there's something to that. Clearly, like we have, networks, especially in America, right, that's lean one way or the other. But I think if a sensationalist story is out, both, Fox News and CNN are probably going to report on it pretty excitedly. And I think we saw that with the fact that Biden also, had some classified documents, right? I don't really think CNN and the New York Times were trying to cover that up. I don't remember who broke the story, but I feel like it might have been someone from the liberal media and not, So I think there's something to that claim. But yeah, I agree that I find Gladwell pretty disappointing, and just focusing on this kind of like framing things in terms of identity politics stuff is just like, I don't know. I feel like there's something hollow and like lacking of substance there. Those are my like initial thoughts anyway.
I think that I said it like right at the beginning of our session last week, where I think that Matt Taibbi does himself a disservice to hearken back to this kind of golden age of media. And to his point, he did say that it's not perfect, but I think Malcolm Gladwell is onto something where like he's kind of idealizing a naive sort of media. And I was thinking about this like basically all week since our last sessions. Like, what is it that's animating these types of media critics? And for me, I think it boils down to the fact that while the media is becoming slightly more epistemologically sophisticated, and by that I mean they don't pretend to be totally objective. They're a bit more honest about where they're coming from and what their politics are. While that's happening, they're becoming more politically annoying, because their politics are becoming more clear, and they're especially annoying to people like Matt Taibbi, who sees this as like a kind of shallow rad lib deference to authority. And so while that is annoying, I don't necessarily think the solution to that is to then pretend that ideology doesn't exist and return to some sort of epistemological naivete where we pretend to be the voice of like the entire mass of the country and have no political or ideological valence.
Yeah, and I thought the comments about, I don't know, like Malcolm Gladwell's whole sort of line of argumentation on the Walter Cronkite thing is just like bizarre to me, because like it seems like what happened was Matt Taibbi made the point that during the Walter Cronkite era, the media had like this specific virtue, and the specific virtue that he mentioned was that like it was well trusted, right? And it seems like what Malcolm Gladwell is saying, he's not really refuting that point. He's not refuting the idea that the media was more widely trusted and less partisan. He's just kind of like pointing out like a vice of that same era that's sort of unrelated to the virtue that that Taibbi was gesturing towards. And it's hard for me to see how that contradicts Taibbi's point, because he didn't say that the Cronkite era was all virtue and no vice. He just said, here's a virtue that it had. And it feels like Gladwell's not really engaging with that.
Yeah, what Ethan just said was very much my frustration with Gladwell, because Taibbi's critique of media now and like what he thinks is worse about media now than media in the Cronkite era is obviously, I hate to, there are a few people I'm less eager to agree with than Douglas Murray, but he's kind of right here. That's like, it's like obviously the respect in which Taibbi thinks it's worse has nothing to do with media becoming more racially or sexually or otherwise diverse, right? Like that's completely, in fact, like really, if you thought that was somehow incompatible, if you thought that this is just a package deal, that like that you either have that like either the like the only way that that media can be less tribalistically partisan and have and have stronger fact checking mechanisms, etc., is to be dominated by white men. I mean, like that's a pretty horrifyingly reactionary view, right? Only white men can do those things. Like
Maybe we'll get a defense of that from Murray, but we'll see.
Yeah, Douglas Murray might say that. So that would be consistent with everything I know about Douglas Murray's worldview. But yeah, like that does just seem separate. And I also like, I don't know. I think I have very mixed feelings about some of what Gordon was saying earlier, because I could see the point about epistemological naivete, right? That that you don't want to, that like sort of like pretending that you're doing a really good job of like capturing of like being objective when in fact you have deep ideological blinkers is not great, right? And it's good to be able to have an honest conversation with that about that. And so like the kind of like a lot of that kind of old style like Chomsky and Herman critique of the of media is all about it, right? Is all about the fact that there are these deep ideological blinkers that that like are being like that belie this pretense to objectivity. But I also wonder if it's progress when you just sort of like openly kind of give up on the goal of objectivity. like even if it's like, yeah, I mean it sort of seems like a little bit like, well, hell, these glasses don't make me see perfectly, so I'm just going to smash them, right? Like like I kind of want media to try, right? Even if it's going to fail, even if it's impossible to perfectly match that ideal, I don't think that means that it's like a worthless ideal that like you just shouldn't bother with at all.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I think like I would never want to suggest that because we're like imperfect beings, we should abandon all professionalism and be purely sort of partisan and enact sort of our vision onto the world because we think we're entitled to as elite media people, which I think is kind of what's happening now. But I think the idea that you can sort of pretend that it doesn't matter, I think that is really naive. And for me, like the solution would be to have like a more ideologically diverse media with different kinds of voices who are accessible to it and less of an agenda setting media. And then kind of in that debate, we figure out kind of where we land. But to have like, one arbiter of the national consensus of reality, that seems like a really unappealing conclusion. It would certainly be unappealing for like people like us who write for left publications, right? So in some sense it's progress. But I see your point. I'm not suggesting that we just like become completely postmodern and have no sense of like professional safeguards or professional.
I mean, there is a certain sense in which, like, I mean, I don't know. I remember a couple of years ago, I was like watching TV in a hotel room, and there was some kind of weird advertisement for like a news packaging service, and there was this line that really struck me in it. There was like, "We deliver you news from every side," and it's like, okay, so we're just throwing out like any pretense to try and to have news that's not that's not side that's not repping a side, right? And there is something that's like a little bit disturbing about that, or about like what are the things, the last thing that Malcolm Gladwell said, like, which is actually one of the weirdest things he said so far, which is that it's not the job of media to make accurate predictions. That's like stockbrokers. And I was like, really? Like, cause like, I was like all prepared to think that like where I thought he was going with that sentence was, it's not the job of the media to make predictions about the future. It's the job of media to be like accurate about, the present, because that's all you can really know, or something like that. And I was like, okay, fair point, Malcolm Gladwell. But like, it's just like, what's this factual accuracy shit? Like all that matters is that, all that matters is that you have the right moral values, which kind of seemed like where he was ended there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
was also
stockbrokers make predictions. The only profession.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, kind of adding on to what Ben was saying in response to Gordon. Like, I think that's kind of my fear also of the attitude of just being critical of these institutions, that like when you start undermining and like providing reasons for why like the ideals that they live up to aren't perfect, it does open the door to that. And I know you didn't mean for it to go down that path exactly, that kind of postmodern path, as you put it, Gordon, but I do think like that's one of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit more resistant. And I often think about just a different way of framing it. I mean, you can go back to John Stuart Mill, someone who gets accused of being some person who worships reason, but like he's also an incredibly fallibilist view of human subjectivity. Like he has at his core, like his whole reason for having the marketplace of ideas, to use that kind of now almost pejorative term, is precisely because our human capacities for objectivity are so compromised that we actually, so like that's his reason, right? It's not that we can actually ever have a perfect access to knowledge. If we did, then like we wouldn't need a lot of these processes and things. And so yeah, that. And then the one other thing I was going to say too is thinking more about the way that Malcolm Gladwell frames, like he's trying to kind of bring in this point against Taibbi about race, and also continues to mispronounce Taibbi's name, if people have been noticing that as well. But yeah, I think I'm just realizing it's pissing me off the more I think about it. It's pissing me off more because I just feel like it's trying to appeal to like the lowest common denominator of like a liberal, like left-wing audience. It's just like, say something about, how he might be, wanting women's voices and these other voices to not have a space. And it's just like, but as you were all correctly pointing out, it's not addressing the argument Taibbi is making, and it just it offends me that he's trying to just appeal to this lowest common denominator.
To be fair, it does seem like the kind of argument that would be made by someone who is informed that there was going to be like a bunch of female college students attending the event.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah, I mean, it just like, and I see a couple people in the chat, saying things like objectivity is a myth. It's a, it's an illusion. It's like, well, I think the idea that perfect objectivity has been achieved, like ever or could be achieved, right? Perfect objectivity probably is a delusion. For all the reasons that we were talking about, if you watched part one of this last week, that you have like, even if you like really did a human job of achieving it in the way you reported stories, just like which stories struck you as newsworthy in the first place, and blah 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 blah. Right? There are 1,000 ways in which implicit values of various kinds impact your reported, but and it's not possible. I'm not going to do a Slovenian accent for this part, but ideology is pervasive, right? There's no escape from ideology. Fair enough. But again, like, is it particularly healthy to not sort of give it their entire time? Like in other words, like it seems like a lot of legitimate left media critique, like the manufacturing consent stuff, is all about pointing out double standards and pointing out the ways that, like, yeah, in the Chomsky and Herman book, the way that like certain kind, like atrocities that were committed by like Soviet allied governments were, considered to be, got like vastly more media attention than, than atrocities committed by American allied governments. And it seems to me like the point of the critique is that it's like, you're assailing them for the fact that they are doing such a bad job of being even-handed, and you want them, and like ideally, right, if the critique were, successful, which would probably require fundamentally economically restructured media. But I mean, like if it were, the goal would be to make them do a better job of those things, right? That it's like you want them to cover, Guatemalan priests who are killed by death squads as much as, Polish priests who are, imprisoned by the communist government or whatever. Like that's and it just seems like moving away from that, even as a regulative ideal. I have like I think you can, and I think this is actually something Gordon and I are great about, right? Like I think you can and should simultaneously say that humans being what they are, even if we were living in some sort of like advanced communist utopia, it would be impossible for us to like fully achieve the ideal. But like that doesn't mean that that sort of holding up the ideal and thinking about whether we're getting further from it or closer to it is worthless.
Yeah, exactly. I think like the fear too, maybe in invoking a category like objectivity, it just seems to be that you can claim something to be objective when it maybe isn't, and then you're like imposing some kind of value. I think like that's kind of the implicit fear in that. And then the other thing is, I often do feel like when people say like objectivity is a myth or objectivity is some delusional. Yeah. I think it's almost based on a bit of a straw man. Like, I don't know how many people believe in this kind of like naive, robust objectivity. Like really, like I think there's very few. I mean, you can even open up science articles and they have entire sections that say limitations, right? Like, I mean, I don't think anyone actually believes. I mean, maybe there's some, but it just seems to me like a pretty rare thing.
I mean, I guess to be fair, I mean, it might be instructive there to compare like science journals to science journalism, right?
True.
That like science journals, like if you actually like read the journal articles where people publish studies, it's all like, this is this incredibly narrow thing and it probably doesn't mean anything, but if it does mean just a little bit, it's this, and here, and here are some other interpretations, and therefore we should do more research. And then you read like the popular like media articles about it, and they're like, amazing new study decisively proves this super counterintuitive thing that the researchers never even said.
Yeah, well, drinking wine fights cancer. I think maybe isn't this like what you do in your research, Gordon, if I'm not mistaken? Like science journalism.
A little bit, yeah, exactly. And I could talk a lot about that. I mean, half the time it is actually the academic, not in the journal, but their press person or the way that they try to curry favor from journalists to get coverage. But I was going to say, I mean, like on the objectivity point, like I take your point, like we shouldn't abandon it completely as a regulative ideal. I would say that the way to think about it, like this is not a new point. This is sort of like the basic premise of like social epistemology, feminist epistemology, and maybe even all back to Mill and before it, is like, if we are to have something approaching objectivity, it's like a socially regulated ideal. It's not like a particular value that we sort of believe in our own heads, or we don't believe ourselves to be objective, but maybe our institutions and the people that we argue with, and through that sort of social discourse, we can approach something that more closely approximates the truth. So that's why I think having the like knee-jerk, let's return to imagining ourselves as objective is the wrong approach, where I would take like the Chomsky and Herman and like the social, political, economic approach as like, no, I mean, if there's a way to be objective, we have to like have a better media with more alternative media and public interest media and like more diversity in media and all those things that might add up to something that's closer to objectivity. It's not Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that, like there are two questions here, right? One is like, what are the sort of correct critiques of Walter Cronkite era media? And then the other one is, has the way this, are the ways that it's changed good, roughly, right? And like, I'm totally down with saying that there isn't an unambiguous answer to that second question. I mean, there are respects in which it's good. I mean, there are, I mean, certainly greater diversity is good, but also like even the thing that Taibbi is bemoaning, I think does have its good sides, that the fracturing of media is good in the sense that, when it's less of a sort of overwhelmingly dominant monolith, there is more room for the kinds of views that everybody on the screen likes, to get out there more. That's definitely good. But I also wonder if it's like, I also wonder how much it's sort of compatible to make all the points you're making about what's wrong with Cronkite era media, and also say that with the possible exception of the fact that there's like a little bit more room for Jacoby kinds of views, most of the ways that media has changed the last few decades are actually for the worse, right? That you can have part of the point that Taibbi, who, it's also funny. It's like I'm much more ambivalent about the guy that probably sounds like right now, but I think the debate brings out the thing where I find him the most compelling. That Taibbi's one of the points that Taibbi makes in his book, Hate Inc., that we were talking about last time about the sort of badness of the fracturing of media, is that it becomes more sensationalistic because you have to because you're in this much more sort of red with tooth and claw kind of competition, for viewers and listeners. Because which also means that you're more likely to rush to print with dubious bullshit, and then you're also less likely to retract it, when it turns out not to be true. Which is also, I know, Victor, you kind of said this was one of the things that you found most plausible in Michelle Goldberg's presentation. I understand why, right? But I also wonder, right? I saw Oliver in the chat had a funny thing where he's like, when she said that, the media prefers counterintuitive stories to ideologically convenient ones, and he's like, citation needed, right? Does it? Right? Because it's sometimes I think when they're counterintuitive in certain kinds of ways, for sure. Right?
It is actually Gladwell's entire career, I will say, to her point, is here is a counterintuitive social theory based on a paper I read.
Yeah,
that's true.
Fair. I mean, I will say, the example I kept thinking about was the Nord Stream pipeline. That when that first happened, mainstream media was full of experts asserting, based on no evidence nor pretense of evidence, that it was an inside job, that Russia, for slightly mysterious reasons, blew up their own pipeline, and then this Seymour Hersh thing came out, and whatever you think about Seymour Hersh or other stories that he's done in recent years that you think of sapped his credibility, or you think this story was way too thinly sourced or whatever, I'm happy to have all those discussions. But it's I don't know. I mean, was it more thinly sourced than 100 things that have gotten tons of mainstream media play, right? Was it more thinly sourced than Russia, paid bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan? That's or is it just I mean, if anything, you think that would have that sort of sensational, shocking value, but it's it just sort of seems Hersh isn't in the club, and there's a sort of ideological distaste for the claim that he's making, and that does seem kind of enough for the the mainstream media not to have much interest in even pursuing it, to be oh my god, here's this bombshell claim, now let's argue about whether it's true.
Yeah, I think another point about the objectivity thing is, I guess it sort of feels like, there are sort of different senses in which people, even in these contexts, sort of use the word objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think depending on the way the word's used, I could agree or disagree that we should have, more or less objectivity. So I feel like a lot of people, when they talk about objectivity, they mean coverage where sort of values are absent to the greatest degree possible. But I'm not so sure that, that's the right ideal, just in the sense that, values, I think, are very important in terms of informing what kinds of stories to tell and so on. I'd much rather have a media that focuses on things that are important and consequential, as opposed to things that are more trivial and unimportant. And that's sort of a value judgment. But I think in terms of, if by objective we mean they're just using like the most sort of truth conducive mechanisms in terms of how they're covering things, then I would completely agree that we should strive to have as much objectivity as possible.
Yeah, right. Like that there's something silly about like the sort of way that I'm just going to keep saying Cronkite era, although honestly, I think like, Taibbi brought him up initially and now, Gladwell can't let him go. But I mean, like, obviously he's talking about a much longer stretch of time than that, but whatever. That like, there is something like kind of ridiculous about some of the like Cronkite era stuff where there's like this elaborate pretense that even when they're like not, like even when they're sort of off the clock, you have to have this weird pretense that like journalists don't have politics, and that there is something like that's like silly about that, and that there is something that's like worth. It's like, yeah, let's just have like a open and honest discussion about like what value judgments are grounded in, what stories you think are important or unimportant, like that seems totally fair. Right.
That sort of thing still exists. I mean, try to go to a protest as a participant, as a journalist for a major mainstream publication. I mean, that was a major sort of sticking point in the last few years with Black Lives Matter and stuff. But it's there. Like, I mean, and it's funny. I mean, like, I'm a journalist and I went to J school and I have a lot of journalism school friends. And they're very vague and they're very cagey. And I don't think it's because they're trying necessarily to hide it. They're still operating in this pretext where they're not invested sort of ideologically, or they think of themselves not to be. They think like, oh, I'm just sort of calling the shots or whatever, but that invariably just makes them sort of like centrists. But yeah, that sort of ideal, that naivete still exists. I mean, to my point, it's sort of changing, but it still exists.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's keep going.
Great debate. Let me join and spend a little bit of time with you before closing statements, just trying to think of some of the questions that are top of mind for this audience, having listened to this back and forth. And let me come to you first, Matt, because I want to pick up on an argument that Malcolm made earlier tonight, that this is about this debate and the issue of trust. Because let's get back to our resolution. Be it resolved, don't trust mainstream media. For some in Malcolm and Michelle's camp, it's about a process. It's about a commitment to a learning, a teaching, a profession. Why isn't that a reason to feel that there is something very special about the mainstream media versus Substack, where you work, where, I don't know, I assume those types of things are somewhat arbitrary as to whether your fellow contributors on Substack really care about fact checking or care about searching out the other side to a story or to an opinion?
Well, first of all, let's talk about process. Michelle brought up the assistant to Donald Trump's campaign manager, Konstantin Kilimnik. She called him a suspected Russian agent. Right. Yeah. He was also, we know definitely he was a source for the U.S. State Department, but his name, Konstantin Kilimnik, was splashed all over the news for a year. Do you know how many reporters called him? 2. Aaron Mate, a Canadian journalist, by the way, and myself. Nobody called him. This person who's supposedly the linchpin of the entire conspiracy, his telephone number is public. It's in the Senate report. Nobody from the Senate called him. Robert Mueller didn't call him. Nobody from the New York Times called him. It was left to a couple of independent journalists to do it, which to me suggests that there's something going on process-wise that's a little different from the way things used to be. Once upon a time, I think journalists were more interested in what was true and what was not true than whether or not this fit the narrative or not. And I think what happened with the Trump-Russia story is, what's the upside for a lot of these institutions to call up somebody like Konstantin Kilimnik and find out his side of the story? Is that going to get on the front page of the New York Times? Probably not. And so, yes, there are processes. Fact checking is important. I do it. I hire fact checkers to do it. But this is not the standard process for all mainstream media institutions anymore. We don't do it as much as we used to. Part of that is for financial reasons.
Wait, I can't sit here and let you make these statements that without any kind of, we don't do that as much as we used to for financial reasons. I mean, I worked at the New Yorker. The New Yorker, if anything, spends more money on fact checking today than it did in the past. I would have thought with my first book, I didn't hire a fact checker, but then I observed a number of errors in it. I also observed that the nature of the journalism world in which we live, the scrutiny of journalists is such that it's really perilous not to have a fact checker. And so now I have fact checkers. Many other people, I think, have observed the same thing, that there is now so much attention paid to the accuracy of things that writers say that you'd better make sure you don't have errors in your. So, I mean, Matt, I understand that you do have this wonderful nostalgia for the way things used to be, but I think that you need to fact check some of your nostalgic notions about the wonderful world of the 1950s. Who was watchdogging the New York Times in the 1950s? Nobody was. It was a tiny little universe of people now watchdog institutions like that, and so they have a higher commitment to the truth.
So first of all, hold on, Matt. Let's bring Douglas in on this. I just want to hear his voice.
Doug is speechless.
I'm never speechless. It's not a problem I suffer from. I can't sit here and listen to Malcolm Gladwell talking about fact checking and the importance of it. Not to get too mean, Malcolm. I read your book, David and Goliath. The chapter on Northern Ireland is more filled with inaccuracies than any other chapter in a non-fiction book I have read. It is, having written a not very well selling, but widely acclaimed book on Northern Ireland myself, my book on Northern Ireland didn't sell anywhere near as much as yours did, Malcolm. But mine was filled with facts. And your chapter on Northern Ireland was so filled with inaccuracies. Irish historians ripped it apart. Would that you had a fact checker, Malcolm. Would that you did your own research. But anyway, let me get back to another point.
I must say, you do a very good job of it. But you must say, you do have a tendency to accuse those who disagree with your opinion.
No, it's not disagreement.
It's
not disagreement, Malcolm. You didn't know that the provisional IRA were responsible for 60% of the deaths in the Troubles. There were basic things you just didn't know, Malcolm. No. I'm sorry, it's not my fault, it's yours and your fact checkers.
I didn't know that the function of this debate was to rehash the accuracy of a chapter in a book.
Well, you were the one that started talking about fact checkers. I'm simply saying, why don't you employ some?
I suspect
or your publishers.
Douglas,
why don't I make the point I wanted to make other than that?
Briefly, yes. Good Lord.
Take the Hunter Biden story.
Oh, here we go. I'm sorry.
Of course you don't want to hear it.
Is there no end to the kind of Twitter stuff you guys are going to dredge up?
Of course you don't want to hear it, Malcolm. Of course you wouldn't, because it goes against your ideological presumptions. That story was a big story, okay? It was a big story. The New York Post, which I write for, but the New York Post, America's oldest newspaper, was silenced on Twitter, was silenced across the media. You know, the Washington Post has now picked it up. It's saying that, yeah, the laptop's true. But why didn't the media pick it up before? Why didn't they call up people? Why didn't they check whether the emails were accurate? Because they didn't want Biden to lose the election. He was their guy. And they weren't going to screw that up. Now, I ask you.
Can I respond to that?
Not only that. This is an important allegation, and I knew the Hunter Biden laptop was going to come up. It had to land, so it's landed at just the right time. So, Michelle, let's come to you on this, because I think many people
I do want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop, because I actually was telling Malcolm, we were talking this morning, and I said, I bet they're going to want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop. And he said to me, really? Who would care about that?
Yeah,
but I want to say this about the Hunter Biden laptop, because again, I feel like this story is this is a revisionist history. I mean, let's remember what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop. The person who wrote the New York Post story asked to have their name taken off of it because they thought the story was unreliable. The people who had the hard drive would not give it to the Washington Post and the New York Times before the election. So you're basically saying, why didn't they rely on the Post reporting that the reporter himself thought considered unreliable? And I went back through some of this stuff because I figured we'd be talking about this. The Washington Post, yes, has been able to confirm they hired forensic experts, were able to confirm some of the emails on the Hunter Biden laptop and some of the other material. There's like really, I mean, I don't think anyone's disputing that Hunter Biden is a, both corrupt and troubled person. But I just want to, I wrote this down because I thought this might come up. Among the reasons for the inconclusive findings was the sloppy handling of the data, which damaged some records. The experts found that the data had been repeatedly accessed and copied by people other than Hunter Biden over nearly 3 years, blah, 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 the FBI. The security experts who examined the data for the Post struggled to reach definitive conclusions about the contents as a whole, including whether all of it originated from a single computer or could have been assembled from files from multiple computers and put on the portable drive. So the media has covered this, but they have also been, I think, careful given the fact that this stuff still cannot be authenticated. And I spoke at the very beginning about the media kind of trying to self-correct, sometimes to a fault. And when there was a leak, when Hillary Clinton's emails were leaked and emails from the DNC were leaked, in 2016. I mean, I was at the Democratic convention and you sort of saw how it turned the mood, how it soured the mood, how it angered so many of the Bernie Sanders supporters. So it had a real impact on the way that race unfolded. And I think that in retrospect, a lot of media came to see that how that material was obtained and how it was kind of strategically disseminated was as important of a story as the contents of those emails, and that they had made a mistake by only focusing on the latter. And so they didn't want to make the same mistake again with the Hunter Biden laptop. And you were arguing, it seems to me, that they should have.
Yeah, so guys, let's have you respond to that, because this could be an example where the media, seeing a campaign of successful disinformation run by a foreign government against a candidate running for president of the United States, could in a sense be replicated again in the Biden laptop. Maybe that was not the case in the end, but wasn't that a responsible thing that only the mainstream media would have done, taking a more cautious approach to uncertainty when reporting the news?
First of all, the 2016 campaign was not disinformation. It wasn't fake. Those emails were real. They were all authentic. The manner of how they were obtained was shady, but they were true. So you can't call it disinformation. Neither was this. This was not disinformation. And news organizations are not required to report on anything. No one has to do the story on the Hunter Biden laptop if they don't want to. They're not obligated to. However, they went beyond not covering it. They wrote stories that this was Russian disinformation. They repeated the statements made by 50 former intelligence officials who described this as having all the earmarks of a Russian information campaign. By the way, they didn't use the word disinformation. But that wasn't even the most important part of the story. The important part of that story wasn't even about Hunter Biden. It was about the decision by Facebook and Twitter at the behest, at least in the case of Facebook, of the US government to quash or dial down that story and deny access to that story. That is a historic moment in the history of censorship in our country.
And
Okay, come quickly on this line.
I've got to add to that. I've got to add that. It's like, Malcolm, you're kind of, oh my God, what a yawneroo the whole Hunter Biden story is. How boring to talk about the idea of corruption at an epic scale in the first family. How boring. Who would want to harp on about that? Let me try the counterfactual on you. It's October 2020, and a huge number of emails are suddenly dumped, revealing unbelievable scandal in the Trump family. I don't want to concentrate on the dick pics and the crack and stuff. Never mind about Don Jr. if he'd been doing that. Let's just focus on the emails. There was a very easy way, Michelle, as you know, to certify whether this stuff was true. You could call up anyone on the email chains and say, did you get this email? They didn't bother with any of that stuff. They'd have been excited as hell across most of the mainstream media if this had been emails from Donald Trump's son saying, and I'm no Trump fan, let's not get into that cheap rut, But if it had been Don Jr. saying to his child, "You've no idea what I've done for this family, the demeaning things I've gone through. I have to give half of everything I earn to my dad." Oh, you're Nauru, definitely. Who'd care about that? No, the point is simply that this was one of the occasions in recent years where the mainstream media showed its transparency as a political organization. That's why we care.
Okay. So this is a key point of the debate that I think, Malcolm, is on a lot of audience members' minds. Why is it when these mistakes, or in case maybe this wasn't a mistake, a sudden cautiousness emerges, why does it always seem to, if we look at the circumstances over the last few years, benefit one political orientation and seem to disadvantage a party or an individual of another political orientation?
Do you guys remember like butthurt emails? I mean, does anybody remember the completely outsized attention paid to Hillary Clinton's information security protocols in the run-up to the 2016 election? I mean, this was on the front page of the New York Times constantly. This was just an absolute drumbeat that the most important thing in the 2016 election was Hillary Clinton having a private email server. I mean, the idea that these distortions always benefit Democrats and work against Republicans is simply not the case. Again, I apologize for making this so, kind of America-centric. And I would similarly say, BuzzFeed published the Steele dossier after the 2016 election, but it was floating around before then, and people didn't report on it because they couldn't verify any of it. So again, I just think the media makes mistakes, but the idea that the media is the idea that these mistakes always run in one direction, it is simply not the case.
Do you want to come in on this, Malcolm?
Well, I was struck once again in listening to our opponents by how much their arguments resemble the kind of classic structure of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory is a theory in which one assumes a degree of unanimity and collaboration amongst one's foes, right? The conspiracist speaks of those who disagree with himself or herself as if they had a single voice. And there are numerous really unpleasant examples of this. This is not one of those. This is a much milder, more naive variant on the traditional conspiratorial model. But nonetheless, when Matt and Doug speak about the mainstream media, they're acting as if there's a big room, possibly in New York or in Washington, D.C., or maybe in between, so that each party has equal access to the room, in which everyone gathers every morning and makes up the agenda for the day, right? And the people fly in from the big news networks, and someone from CBC comes down, and this cabal of high-minded, well-paid, elite white, as it turns out, journalists, some of them, the ones that Matt seems to have such affection for, gather together and set the agenda for the country. Now, I don't know where this room is. I speculated that maybe it's in Maryland, because that would be equidistant between these two places. But this is a fantasy, right? A conspiratorial fantasy. The truth is that the elements, and this is why I made a big point about their failure to define what the mainstream media is, and it's a crippling failure. Because they never really grasped and told us what they were talking about, they were free to construct this mythological thing where all these people get together and set the agenda. There is no thing, and there is no agenda. There are a variety of disparate voices, and they have chosen to cherry pick and create this complete mythology.
It's so strange. It's so strange hearing you debate, Malcolm, because you listen to nothing that your opponents say. It's quite extraordinary. I've met it before, but never quite so badly as it occurs in you. You keep saying things that neither of us have said, and then you try to pathologize what we say.
What
You
did I-
decide to say things like, oh, it's a
Wait,
conspiracy
Douglas?
theory. If it comes from this side, it's a conspiracy theory. You see, we don't do our research. We're just conspiracy theorists. Apparently mild dose of it, he says, in his excellent medical-like analysis of his opponents. We just have a mild dose. No, Malcolm, why don't you listen to what comes out of our mouths and try to learn something from it, as I am with you this evening? But at the moment, all I get is you dismissing every single story we come up with, every egregious failure of the mainstream media. I've given you a definition of what I think of as the mainstream media, so your attempt to claim that we haven't answered it yet is just another straw man in your massive legion of straw men you keep creating this evening. But I beg you to actually consider the fact that what we are describing is, even if you think not as accurate as you would like, an expression of a problem that is going on in our societies. Functioning liberal democracies need to have trust in their media. And the best that your side has been able to come up with so far tonight is to say, we get things wrong quite often, but you should trust us.
So where do we find trust, Matt? I mean, do we find trust in Substack? I'm generally curious about that. Where, if it's not mainstream media, which we traditionally have turned to, for better or worse, to seek out facts that are widely understood to be true, then where does that truth factory now exist, or does it not exist at all?
It doesn't come from an institution. The only way, there's no shortcut to trust in media. The only way to get it is by doing a good job over and over and over again, not getting things wrong, and when you do get things wrong, admitting it. There's no other way to do it in media. And the media, the mainstream media, what we're talking about tonight, has repeatedly gotten things wrong, not admitted it, not owned up to it. I mean, Malcolm is talking about conspiracy theories. Let's talk about a story that was huge in America for years. This idea that Donald Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, was making visits to Prague. Now, this came from the infamous Steele dossier. If you read the dossier, basically the idea is Trump sent his lawyer to go meet with hackers and Kremlin representatives in Prague. And Steele says that they would preferably be Romanian hackers who would afterwards retreat to Bulgaria, where they could use that country as a bolt hole to lie low. If that's not a conspiracy theory, I don't know what is. This story was taken seriously by every major news organization in America for years on end with no evidence. And he accuses us of being conspiracy theorists. It's preposterous.
Okay. Let's, just in our remaining time here before we go to closing statements, the other part I want to touch on for the benefit of this audience is power and the powerful, and how media either
Okay, so I'm cautiously optimistic that there might be some interesting issues that haven't been broached yet, and that last part that he just said they're going to do before the closing statement. So maybe this is a good time to pause and give people a chance to talk about what we've seen so far in this part of the debate.
Yeah, I mean, a lot happened. I think one of the things that stood out, I think it might have been. Yeah, I was thinking about, like, in this discussion about the extent to which the media is ideologically driven or not, or like kind of the balance between ideologically driven versus just driven by sensationalism, I suppose. And I think there is evidence, like, to kind of give some weight to, like, as much as I find Douglas Murray like unlikable and really annoying, I do think there is something unique about the Trump era that, like, I do think you saw, like, some special effort among the, like, so-called liberal media to cover as many negative stories about Trump as possible. But I think in a way it kind of made sense at the time, because he was saying things like the media is the enemy of the people and all these things. So I can imagine being inside a newsroom, and I think it would be, like, really hard to resist, not moving things in a direction that goes against a figure like Trump, and I'm sympathetic to that. But so I think like that there is something to that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's also kind of interesting, this whole idea about who cares about the Hunter Biden story, like this kind of appeal to care, like, well, who cares? It's kind of interesting to me when people just kind of say that in this dismissive tone, like, you know, nobody really cares about this. It's like, well, I mean, people obviously do, like a lot of people do. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's a couple other things that might come up later, but I'll leave.
I will say that I do think on that Hunter Biden point, Douglas Murray flubbed like what would otherwise be very easy to be like a series of good points about it by like trying to do this role reversal thing. It's like, well, what if, you know, just stay with me here into this, like enter this amazing alternate reality with me where counterfactually there was like a bunch of corruption in the Trump family. It's like, yeah, you're not really helping your case here, buddy. You know, I think you could argue without that the Hunter Biden laptop story was, you know, or at least aspects of it were newsworthy. I don't think that, like, you know, dick pics and crack smoking were, you know, like obviously people wanted to see it, but they have but I think there's a better case you could make that those weren't newsworthy in the sense that we're talking about.
This part for me, I think it harkens back to something that Ethan said, like right at the top of our last session, where it's like it's a bit hard to judge their kind of claims against the proposition that's sort of on the table. It feels like we're getting into especially the bickering phase, where it's like, you know, I got this more right than you did, and your publication sucks for sort of all these reasons. So I'm not sure what to make of it, because we're getting further and further away from anything approaching like propositions towards coherent theory of the media. In fact, the only thing that approaches that is the sort of conspiracy theory remark, which is like, again, just so condescending. I mean, at this point, basically nothing that Malcolm Gladwell says seems to serve their side. And he is clearly obsessed with implying that Matt Taibbi is sexist. Like, I mean, we've all said it, but it's getting a little outrageous.
Yeah,
he's brought it up so many times.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yes, very much that. But it's all, yeah, like it is a really ridiculous caricature. That's like, if you have any sort of critique of like the ideological agenda of mainstream media, or you know or you know, you think it's like inaccurate in service of that, whatever, like, you know, that you must be saying that it's like all lizard people. Like, I mean, that's you know, a slight caricature of what Gladwell said, but not nearly as much as what Gladwell said as a caricature of what Taibbi and Murray were saying. I actually agree. I'm not, you know, I didn't come into this as a big Michelle Goldberg fan, and I'm like less of one even than I was as a result of seeing her in this debate. But I still agree with whoever it was in the chat who said that it would have been a better debate if it was just one-on-one between Taibbi and Goldberg.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Also, with regards to the point about, you know, defining the mainstream media, somebody threw in some line at some point where they were like, well, I think it was Douglas Murray, where he's like, well, I didn't want to debate how we should define mainstream media the whole time. And it's like, you don't have to debate how we should define it. Just tell me how you're using the term.
Yes, exactly.
That can be very helpful.
Totally. Yeah, you don't have to. Yes, you can absolutely not spend a moment arguing about it, but just like clarify when I say you shouldn't trust the mainstream media. Here's who I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Which he did a little bit of, but like, you know, but yeah, he only did it after the. I thought we were going to argue about this.
Yeah, for sure. There were some sneaky moments there. But you know, I think it was Goldberg who did bring up a good point, which, you know, back to something I said earlier about the fact that, you know, the balance between the media being ideologically driven and sensationalist driven. And I think like she did bring up a good point about like the Hillary Clinton emails. Like, I feel like that, you know, that was something that the media was endlessly covering. I also think back to like Benghazi, which I feel like was being covered. I mean, maybe that was being covered more by Fox News, but still it was being talked about, right? Like, it wasn't being suppressed by like the more liberal media. So, and I think because there's some kind of sensationalism on both those cases, right? Like the emails and the
Totally.
Benghazi thing.
The other thing
Yeah.
I would say is just kind of like, they've been talking a lot about defining the media, but I don't think anyone has asked how we define trust. And that was like one of the sort of defining, like the things that Victor and I were basically debating in our last session came down to what do we mean by trust? And I don't really think anyone in the debate has even clarified like what exactly should your posture be towards the media, like complete uncritical acceptance, like sort of skeptical. I mean, like it's sort of a basic question.
Yeah.
That's a good question. And I was sort of thinking about that as well when I think it was Taibbi got pushed to kind of define what he thinks makes the media, like what makes for a good process. Like, because I think the host was saying something about Substack, and he's like, so should we trust Substack? And he was like, no, we should just trust media sources. That he mentioned a couple of things, but one of the things that stood out is like, when you get something wrong, admit that you're wrong. And I wonder whether or not like a good definition of trust is like, or like a criteria for finding trust in something is when we do see that happen, right? When we do see that an institution admits when it gets something wrong. And I think that goes back to sort of my perspective on the debate in the last, in our last session. I do feel that we have a lot more reason to think that the mainstream media, this is comparing to an alternative, right?
Yeah.
Is going to admit that they get something wrong. Like I have more faith. I do have more trust that generally speaking, if like a story was reported wrong, the mainstream media will admit that it got it wrong. And I worry obviously about the kind of explosion of alternative media sources, some of which are really good and some of them might earn, right, that trust where you think that they're going to admit when they get something wrong. But there's a whole shitload online. And there's a lot of streamers and different kinds of like content creators on YouTube who will report on some story, and then like you'll find out what they were saying was complete bullshit, and they'll never fucking say anything, and their audience doesn't even care because they're just there for that dopamine hit of just like, yes, this guy's saying shit that I agree with, right?
Well, I also think that like just as a side note to that, I think there's this really frustrating thing that happens where people don't make nearly enough distinction between two completely different things that people could mean by getting something wrong. So one of them is that you like reported, like you said that something is true and then it turned out to be false, right? Like that. So like, I think we were talking about last time, like some of, if you were in, if you were in mainstream to progressive media spaces, then like some of the Kyle Rittenhouse stuff would be like an example of that, or like, if you're in right-wing media, everything anybody ever said about the 2020 election would be an example of that. But like, that's one thing, but all too often and I even got a little bit of this from Michelle Goldberg, I think more in what we were watching last week. What people mean by getting things wrong is that you're like, your best guess about what would happen in the future was incorrect. Right, like you didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine, or you thought that like what was her other example? You thought that like the Dems were going to get wiped out in the midterms or whatever, and it's like, well, that's not actually a credibility damaging wrongness. That's just like at least not in the same not in the same way, right? Like it might show that you were maybe sometimes objectively surprising things happen is the other thing, but like also things that would be improbable do happen, right? If the if the weatherman says there's a 90% chance of rain and then it doesn't rain, that doesn't mean that he was wrong, right? But also like, yeah, maybe at worst it shows that there was something that was like you were missing in your analysis, but that's not quite the same thing as you were being untrustworthy. And I just, yeah, those things I think it's like really dangerous to conflate those, like which again I think Michelle Goldberg was even doing in earlier in this debate. But then the other thing I would say about this is just that that Taibbi answer that Victor was highlighted, I think in some ways was like rhetorically probably the best answer he could have given in the moment, but also I agree with you. Like you push on it a little bit. It's like a really weird, almost evasive answer, because like what he's saying is, well, here's how individuals can earn people's trust. And it's like, okay, but is that all we're talking about? We're talking when we're arguing about whether to trust the mainstream media. I thought we were arguing about what kinds of institutions were trustworthy.
He basically said the best way to earn trust is to be trustworthy.
Yeah, right.
Well, I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, what do we do with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the point about, there's a meaningful difference between getting like current facts wrong and making a wrong prediction. Although to be fair, I do think there's like, the more like a person or an institution incorrectly predicts things, that might be somewhat of a hint that like, okay, well, maybe you have the current facts wrong. Right. Because, generally speaking, like people with a more accurate picture of reality and what the current facts are going to have like a more accurate ability to predict what's going to happen. But, of course, that's not foolproof. You can have like the best analysis possible, and surprising things will always still happen sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bad, like if you're just looking at instances, right, then like it doesn't mean very much, right? If you say like, if like one person is just like making inaccurate predictions dramatically more than another person is, then like, sure, I take your point. I mean, that's like a pretty good reason to suspect that they have a less accurate idea of what the current facts are.
Yeah. I was thinking about something else that Michelle Goldberg was saying too, about in response to this whole thing about the Hunter Biden laptop story. And she had like an anecdote about why they didn't report on it, right? And something to do with the fact that, that they wouldn't give over the hard drives before the election. And I don't know, this may have happened because I wasn't paying enough attention to it, but I was thinking how like that maybe one of the things that is also kind of sowing the seeds of distrust is the fact that there isn't that much transparency, at least it seems to me, about how the decisions get made about what to report on and what not to report on. So like maybe they did give a story, so like someone can maybe correct me, but I think like that could have been interesting for the New York Times or someone to say like, here's why we're not reporting on the story. And similarly, that sort of makes me think about social media platforms right now, and how I feel like one of the biggest problems with why there's like this big kind of distrust of them is this kind of lack of transparency about why people get banned, why people don't get banned. Like, I feel like that's a big problem, and that is like leading to a lot of mistrust of these institutions, which isn't quite the media, and I think like that could go a long way of just saying, this is why the decision was made to ban this. This is the reasoning. And then there's like more transparency with that. And yeah, this debate, by the way, also took place just before, I believe, Taibbi started releasing the Twitter files.
Oh yeah.
And all that stuff. So I was thinking about like the Twitter files too, which I probably didn't pay enough attention to, but I know that's kind of gained him a lot of, and maybe we'll talk about that later, but I think that's somehow related to this question of like the transparency within Twitter, at least. But
yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was right. Yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about the sort of question about like surprising things happening and all that stuff, because it's like like in the Ukraine case. I mean, like I think part of the reason why so many people, not just Western anti-interventionists, right, but like so many people who are like pretty hawkish establishment people who were like all for current U.S. policy in Ukraine and all that, were pretty sure that Russia wasn't going to invade, is that it would have been like an incredibly irrational and self-destructive thing for them to do. And it just turns out sometimes imperial powers do really irrational and self-destructive things, which, to be fair, there was previous evidence for. This is not a new revelation about how geopolitics works. But I think obviously it's most like it's the most bad when you make really inaccurate predictions that are about like how things that you're like proposing or advocating are going to go, right? And you're like, oh, I think this could be great. The Iraqis will welcome us with liberators and sprinkle flowers at our feet, and then there's certainly a credibility problem there. But I also just wanted to say, like, I I mean, I agree with you, Victor. Like, it would be good to have much more transparency about how those decisions are made. You know, I think there's like I mean, I could see sometimes if you think, well, there's not enough there to the story for us to like feel right about like trumpeting it up. It would be like undermining if you were like, front page, top of fold, here's why we're not covering it, right? You're sort of, you sort of are giving oxygen to the thing that you didn't want to give oxygen to. But like, I think there's a way to do it, right? That you could like be much more transparent about that. And I'd also point out on that specific example about Hunter Biden's laptop that like a lot of what Taibbi was injected to wasn't just, well, I mean, he was very explicit about this. He was like, look, you don't have to cover what you don't want to cover, right? Like, fine. But was mainstream media sources actually like suggesting that the story wasn't credible, or suggested that it was even maybe Russian, disinformation or whatever. And like, look, I mean, if there's not enough evidence that the story is true, like, what's the evidential bar for making those claims?
Yeah.
All right, let's watch a little bit more.
There holds these to account or not. And I think, Michelle and Malcolm, people would observe today that there are an awful lot of billionaires that now own large chunks of mainstream media. Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, the Hunt family, the Boston Globe, Rupert Murdoch, a whole swath of properties. Mr. Buffett, I understand, owns 30 newspapers in America. Do you guys acknowledge, or do you fear, are you concerned about the extent to which mainstream media now is a plaything of some very powerful corporate interests that may not have the interests of citizens or their democracy at heart?
I think that that's obviously true. I mean, right? I think that that's inarguable. I would be surprised if there was any difference of opinion between us on that. I don't think that that's something, I mean, it's something that is new in terms of the scale of the wealth, because we live in an age of ever escalating inequality, but it's not a new thing that very rich people have controlled the press. That's been true for as long as there has been a press in this country. I do think, however, that when you asked before about how you restore trust, and again, I know I keep saying this, I apologize if this is not totally relevant to the Canadian context, where you have, kind of media organizations funded by the government. In the United States, where you don't have that, except for things like Voice of America and NPR, one of the biggest crises in terms of trust in the mainstream media, I believe, has sort of very little to do with ideology and much more to do with corporate consolidation. There's been an absolute decimation of local media, and that doesn't just kind of impoverish our view of what's going on in the country. It impoverishes the industry, because that used to be the way that you came up in journalism. You started working at a local small town paper, you moved to a bigger one, maybe you ended your career at somewhere like New York Times or the Boston Globe or the LA Times. But it gave people, my father's also a journalist. It gave people like my father, who didn't go to an Ivy League school. I mean, I didn't either, but who, sort of wasn't a great student, but was really into sports and started out as a sports reporter and then became a crime reporter. You had a non-elite path into the mainstream media. It was much more of a blue-collar profession because of the structure of it, because of the way you sort of learned the craft. And it also cultivated trust, because you could see for yourself if the world that the newspaper or the local news was describing was the world that you saw. You would see people you knew, things that were happening in their community reflected in the newspaper. And so you would be able to develop a kind of different relationship. You knew journalists, you saw journalists in your community. That has been decimated, but that is not a story of left-wing ideological capture. That is a story of kind of amok capitalism and plutocracy.
Thanks, Michelle. Well said. So a similar question for you guys, which is, there's another billionaire out there who's got his hands on a media platform. His name is Elon Musk, and it's called Twitter. So, I mean, don't we need the mainstream media even more in the face of Elon Musk's Twitter 2.0?
Well, no. I mean, the issue with Twitter is about whether or not there are hands secretly on the levers behind the algorithms. And the problem with Twitter as a platform in recent years, as I think everybody who studied it knows, is that there has been a prioritization of certain accounts, shadow banning, all sorts of stuff that Twitter pretended it wasn't doing and then admitted that it was. And of course, the usual political bias. Now, you can see the political bias in the people who are coming back on Twitter since Elon Musk took it over. There are no cancelled left-wing accounts coming back on because mostly it wasn't left-wing accounts that were being cancelled. It was right-wing ones, conservative ones, including ones I have no taste for or appetite for. But the fact is that there was a shadow game going on at Twitter. And we will discover in the coming weeks, as Elon makes the discoveries clearer, we will discover exactly what that looked like, how behind the scenes Twitter was able to lean to subdue certain accounts, certain stories, how it was able to promote other ones. But that's if I can say so, a slightly separate question to this one. Hopefully, Twitter and other social media companies would simply allow a flourishing of the media so that everyone can have their say. It would not be something, for instance, which decided that if a conservative newspaper drops a very big story before an election, you lock that newspaper out of its account for weeks on end.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to closing statements. We're going to take these in the opposite order of the opening. 3 minutes on the clock for each of you. I'm going to leave the stage, and Malcolm, pass it over to you to kick us off for the closing statements. Thank you.
Thank you. Here's what I think the debate boils.
All right. I guess before we get to the closing statements, I want to pause again here. I will say I sort of said some dismissive things earlier about Michelle Goldberg, but she did actually. I think she was actually really solid at some of the structural stuff just now.
Yeah, I was going to say, surprisingly, I think this might have been like the best point of the night, even though I didn't think she was the best debater. I do think she maybe like took a little bit of the wrong conclusion out of it. Like the idea that a more concentrated and plutocratic media can't be more ideologically captured, for instance, or ideologically homogenous. Like I would say an elite media where that career path she described is no longer available means you have an especially credentialized media where people that are journalists have to go to the best schools, go through internships, come out with a certain class position and therefore are even more ideologically captured. But I mean, the general point of like,
and just to throw in there, like, I also think that there's this dynamic that sometimes happens in discussions about that exact point that you just made, where like those of us, who are on, the left, to the left of liberalism, will be very frustrated at the accusation of left-wing, media bias for obvious reasons. You're like, what, the corporate media that loves the Pentagon and blah, 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 like that's left-wing. All of which is, a correct response as far as it goes to that complaint. But I think it does miss something that a little bit, which is that there's sometimes people can kind of end up talking past each other here because, people who start from ideological starting points that we like even less than we like liberals, oftentimes some of what they're sort of gesturing at when they talk about like left-wing media bias is actually media bias in favor of the sort of technocratic liberal ideology that is absolutely pervasive in like the Democratic Party, for example. And yeah, I mean, everything that you just said, Gordon, I mean, that does lend itself towards that. If you have a hyper credentialized media, people who tended to go to elite colleges, etc., they are more likely to have that sort of, technocratic liberalism, as their outlook, that's like, oh, you should just like leave everything to the, the best and the brightest to figure out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I also found it pretty funny. And I think someone in the chat already kind of said this, when like Douglas Murray's just like left-wing accounts never get banned from Twitter. Like I mean, that's one of the things that really pisses me off about and pissed me off when I was there live. It's just like the way people would be clapping for things that were just straight up lies that he said. And like, I can't think of other things he said, but like last week, but I feel like he
the
had
Queen
a bunch
story,
of lies.
remember? They've never said anything bad about, or
Yeah, I
anything good
know.
about England.
Yeah. And then he also said something like, he basically pretty much just said that like the CBC is like a lapdog for the government, which is just totally untrue. And like people are clapping at it. And it's like, I feel like he does that a lot.
Oh yeah, he did that. So yeah, we were talking about that last week. But yeah, in the part of the debate we were watching tonight, he said, "Oh, when I say mainstream media, I mean, for example, media organs that are owned by the government, and so they do what the government says, whatever."
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that is a incredibly dubious conflation, right? You know, that that like something's publicly funded, therefore they're more likely to. I mean, just to sort of like pick an obvious case, right? I mean, like, where were you? Not that you got nearly enough of them in either place, right? But in British media in 2003, where were you like more likely to hear anti-war views, right? You know, Rupert Murdoch's Sky News or the BBC.
Yeah, exactly.
And well, my mailman picks and chooses what he wants to deliver to me. So he's part of the
he's owned by
censorship
the
brigade. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're trying to like grab your mail from the mailman, he's like, not that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I don't know if we want to like go down this path, but like as someone who didn't maybe pay enough attention to that whole Twitter file story, like I'm just curious if any of you like have like opinions on it, like because I know like Taibbi is getting a lot of shit for it, and like from what I saw, like there didn't seem to be anything that explosive. Like I feel like from the stuff that I saw, it was like things that I felt like I already knew, maybe like the way that some of the details were. So I don't know if people like have kind of strong views or on that issue. No.
I did not follow the Twitter files, to be honest. I didn't even read anything about them.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I followed like a little bit of the first sort of set of tweets, but I mean, how many episodes have there been now? Like 10?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, or more than that. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I think the general kind of like narrative that big tech has an outsized grip on our discourse and it's like being influenced by government operatives, or they try to, seems right to me. But
yeah,
the specific like details of if anything in there was like a bombshell, I don't really know. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. Ben, did you follow it closer?
Yeah, I did. Yes and no, right? So I will say, so I did actually, I did actually write something about the Twitter files early on, and so I was definitely following it pretty closely. Obviously, I was following it very closely up to the point that I wrote about it, right? Because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, for that article. But also, as you say, I mean, this show has been going on for, it's like, it's like asking, did I watch The Simpsons? It's like I did the first, every episode in the first 10 or 11 seasons many times, but but I don't know much about what's happened since then. So
37 is starting to pick up, trust me.
37.
Exactly. So I will say, though, even in those early, well, I guess I'll say two things. One is that I do have the impression that there was like a much bigger range to the kinds of subjects they were talking about later on, as we got into the many, many, many installments since those early ones. And in particular, when I did write about it, so for the Daily Beast, the article was called "Twitter Files Are Too Important to Be Left to Elon Musk's Pals." So I got a couple people get mad at me about the headline, which, if literally is like, generally the headline and the like deck, right? A little description under that, or like the two parts of an article that a writer did write. But, because of the implication that, Matt Taibbi was Elon Musk's pal, which some people thought was unfair. Although, if you kind of look at somebody said on Rogan the other week, it's verging into pal territory, but whatever. But like the larger point was, that I was making was that I actually did think that even in those early installments, there were things that were like legitimately important and disturbing that were in there. I think that, and I think that it's which made it a shame. I thought that they were only being shared with writers who, I mean, I wouldn't call Taibbi even now a right winger, but like who shared a certain set of culture war affinities and preoccupations, right? I think that would be fair. That one of the people, I don't remember his name anymore, but like the person who, because it was like the first few installments, the baton was being passed back and forth between Taibbi and Barry Weiss. And then like the third person they brought in, whose name I do not recall off the top of my head.
Li Fong?
No, Li Fong was later.
Oh,
and I actually think Li Fong was the most interesting out of the ones that I saw, because but I'll get to that in a second. But the third person they brought in initially was like somebody who'd like literally written a book that was called like How Wokeness is Destroying American Liberal Cities or something. It's like, okay, this is like calculated to get half the population not to take this stuff seriously. But I still thought that like a lot of what they were describing is like, no, this is actually pretty bad, right? Like that like even the very early stuff about how both the Biden campaign in 2020 and the Trump White House were like routinely making censorship requests to Twitter, which were often honored. And later on, I mean, like I know some of it got much worse, like about like literally like the FBI, like meeting with Twitter executives to encourage them to make particular censorship decisions. And I mean, there really is pretty bad stuff in there. But my problem with it, and this goes back to what we were talking about last week, is, and really, my problem with in particular with like the range of people who are selected to do it, right, is that like these are people who do tend to, I mean, look, Barry Weiss, I guess, is probably, I mean, she was really awful on Palestine, but like overall, she's probably some kind of like, I don't know, shitty centrist who like, votes for Democrats or whatever. There's, Taibbi, I'm not going to waste any more time, sort of classifying him than we already have, whatever. But like all of these people, there's a range of politics, but there's like, their preoccupations, their enemies, right? Who they're going after most of the time. Like there's a certain sameness there, and you can really tell. It's like the first several installments about this were about the Hunter Biden laptop and the New York Post thing, and like the Trump getting banned after January 6th. I'm not even saying those are unimportant topics, but like there are also topics that we've heard so much about already. And these are exactly the kind of topics that people with those preoccupations, when you give them keys to this vast amount of information, like those are the first thing they're going to do searches for. Whereas like what I wanted, and to be fair, I actually think some of the Li Fong stuff did start to do some of what I was asking for in my article. But like what I was pushing in my article is like, okay, but like, can we maybe hear about like the Defense Department's censorship requests? Can we maybe hear about like Palestinian accounts? Like this is the stuff that I'd be much more curious about. I'm not saying that what you're exposing isn't bad, but I think that the choice of priorities is telling, and like also just the fact that like in like I think that first installment, maybe when Taibbi says that there were routine requests from both the Trump White House, the Biden campaign, that he doesn't even give an example of one of the Trump requests, right? Because he's like so fixated on moving on to the Hunter Biden stuff.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Ben. Like in terms of what makes it easy to sort of dismiss, even though maybe we shouldn't completely. Like it seems like a lot of these folks are preoccupied more with wokeness than like elite power networks. If you know what I mean? Like they're not as worried about like corporate concentration and it's like sort of the tentacles of the government within that as they are about like censorship of the like bad views, or I mean censorship prima facie is bad, but like the way that
Sure,
they express
yeah.
it. Yeah.
No, totally, right? I mean, this is the thing that's like always like drives me crazy about so many people that like I absolutely hate how many commentators will like end up like actually shifting their politics based on like whatever annoys them the most, right? You know, it's like if you hate ultra woke weirdos the most, then like you move to the right, you know, and you know, if you spend most of your time like, you know, resenting, you know, like the sort of most like grotesque MAGA Republicans, then like you just want to put like a minus wherever they put a plus, and vice versa, even if that means that you end up having to defend like NATO and the CIA. You know, it's like all of it just seems like just a horrible way of going about this stuff to me. It's like, yeah, you can think multiple things at the same time and also make reasonable priority assessments. Like, is there a certain segment of like progressive-y, you know, media and academic stuff that's like silly and censorious and, you know, and like obsessed with like, you know, very dubious social justice-y claims and language policing and stuff? Yeah. Is that more important than like economic inequality or, you know, war and peace or like 20 other things? I mean, obviously not.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a deliberate choice on like Elon Musk's part to just share the story with like kind of these like more anti-establishment, although like, I mean, I don't, that term could mean a lot of things. I guess just like people like independent anti-establishment journalists who tend to get caught up in these like culture war issues, or is it more, because I don't know if like the New York Times was offered or like these other media were offered the Twitter files. Like, I don't actually know how that process worked.
That's a really good question. I also think that like, okay, so I mean, like ideally, I think the way to do it would just be like, just do like a big WikiLeaks style dump. And if you have to do a little redacting, fine. You know, you could surely pay a couple people at Twitter to do that, right? You know, that like, but like that would be my first choice, assuming for the sake of argument that wasn't realistic. My second choice would be like at least have a much broader range of journalists that you share this with. And I don't know. I mean, I actually think it's entirely possible that Elon Musk thought he was doing that because he's just like not really aware, you know, his horizons are really limited, right? So it's like, I don't know, who's like the most left-wing person I can think of? That Taibbi? You know, I would have liked it if like, you know, I don't know, Amy Goodman, you know, Bronco Marchetti, right? You know, that like some of you know, like it wouldn't have actually been very hard, right? For like to like actually ask around and get like a legitimately wide range of views, right? I mean, like have some people who are just like have the opposite culture war politics to these people.
Yeah, exactly.
Who like I don't like, who are just like, you know, sort of progressive-y, you know, progressive liberals who just, you know, spend all day every day, you know, getting mad at Matt Taibbi, like, you know, like have a couple of them give access to the Twitter files, right? Like that way too. I mean, honestly, I mean, this is like a very
give it to Michelle Goldberg.
Yeah, give it to Michelle Goldberg. Absolutely. Like why not? Right? I mean, like to have an offer to her. I'd love that. Like that's like, I mean, this is, you know, you were talking about John Stuart Mill earlier, Victor, and I mean, this is like roughly the million point here, right? I mean, just have like, you know, given that everybody is going to have priorities and values and all of that stuff that's going to dictate, you know, like which pieces of information they're likely to lift out. At least give us like a wide variety of people who are operating from different biases and let them all fish in that pond and see what they come up with.
Yeah, give the Twitter files only to Walter Cronkite.
Get a Ouija board and ask Walter what he thinks is newsworthy here. He keeps, you know, like you know, you keep trying to get him to tell you which searches that, you know, you should do in the Twitter files, and he just keeps trying to tell you what hell is like. Let's keep watching.
Goes down to, and that is that our opponents believe that the mainstream media they're concerned that the mainstream media, to the extent that they have told us what it is filled with people who don't think like they do, and that fact makes them uncomfortable. And in support of this, they have given us a long list of rather predictable hot button topics taken from their Twitter feed. And my question was, what would make them happy? So what would restore the trust of Matt and Doug in the mainstream media? And I think with Matt, the answer is obvious. He would like, the world resembled 1955 again. That would fill him with joy. Doug would like more stories on the Hunter Biden laptop.
4 times you're going to play the race
but more
card?
seriously,
I mean, really?
I think that they would be happier if they felt that the composition of prestigious journalistic institutions more closely reflected the full range of ideological attitudes in the American public. That is actually a serious proposition. I don't mean to make light of it at all. But it is one that makes me a little uncomfortable, because I don't think that you can ultimately say that trust in institutions is reserved solely for institutions that perfectly match the characteristics of the general population. It's like saying that we don't trust kindergarten teachers because kindergarten teachers are overrepresented with people who have an enormous amount of patience for temper tantrums of 4-year-olds. I mean, they are an extraordinary and very specific subgroup of the population that performs very well in that particular task. More generally, though, when we say of journalists, that I don't think we should be judging the quality and trustworthiness of journalists by the composition of that group or by their private ideological positions. I believe that in a liberal society that we have to believe that the people who compose our professions can place their professional obligations above their personal ideological positions. And if you don't believe we are capable of that act of transformation, then you can't have trust in any of the institutions that make up liberal society.
Thank you for that closing statement, Malcolm. We're now going to go to Douglas. Same opportunity, 3 minutes on the clock.
Well, Malk, I'm going to try to take this more seriously than you did in your endless creation of straw men, which just is ceaseless this evening, and address what I think is the real problem we have in our century in terms of information technology. Having different opinions is so 20th century. This century, we have different facts, and it's lethal. It's absolutely lethal for the functioning of society. And if you want to see how lethal it is, look at the situation in America, where not just the media, but every institution, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Supreme Court, every institution, you decide whether it's for your side or not. It's disastrous for society, but it starts with the facts. And when the facts go wrong, or you become glib about them, or decide that it's just the facts that will suit your side, or pretend you're playing a game of honesty and are not actually playing a game of honesty, everything else in the society can go to hell. This side has not been saying any of these straw men that you've been so kindly creating this evening, Malcolm. We've been saying that the mainstream media cannot be trusted. That is all. We're not saying don't read it. I repeat, we're not saying don't absorb it. Of course, you're an idiot to say that. What, you think we're only going to read Substacks for the rest of life? There's not even time. But the mainstream media is currently failing. It is failing you, the public. It is failing its employees. It's failing at its central task. You quoted one example of what journalism was meant to consist of. I would quote another, what George Orwell said. It's out on his statue outside the BBC. Sadly, the employees do not read it every morning before going in. But George Orwell famously said that the job of a journalist was to tell people facts they don't want to hear. The problem we have in our century coming up is that people will be paying for and absorbing only the facts they want to hear. The argument we are making is one of hygiene, basic hygiene in the media, in the mainstream media. I don't want to blow it up. I don't want an end to it or anything like it. I spent a significant amount of my life in the mainstream media. We just want it to be honest. We just want it to be factual. We don't want it to chase its own prejudices. We just want it to speak truth, whatever that is. That's not so radical.
Thank you, Douglas. Michelle, thank you for an excellent debate. Let's have your closing remarks, please.
Me? Okay. So I think that I don't necessarily disagree with Douglas that this kind of constant hygiene is necessary, that journalists need to, I don't even know if objectivity is the right frame, but there does need to be a sort of a constant conversation, institutional constraints, as well as, kind of a certain professional pride in being able to distinguish between what you hope is true and what you actually find. The argument that I want to make is that it is only the mainstream media that sort of has that ethos. If you read conservative media, you will not often find, occasionally you will, but I think in general, you will not often find a lot of stuff that conservatives don't want to hear. I mean, likewise, if you read a blog devoted to the various, kind of failings of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, or whatever, they're not going to suddenly say, oh, I thought they got that story wrong, but when I looked at it again, they really got it right. I know from being in newsrooms, from being around journalists, that there is a hunger out there to find the counterintuitive story, to find the unusual story. Very recently, the New York Times did a big piece on puberty blockers that made a lot of our readers extremely angry. The piece was about, that these are kind of given to kids who either, kind of are transgender or believe that they're transgender to pause puberty. And then later on, if they decide to kind of continue with their transition, they can start on cross-sex hormones. And the piece featured 3 children. One of them was a trans girl who from a very early age had identified as female, who went on puberty blockers, later started estrogen, was very glad, she and her family were very glad that she hadn't had to go through a male puberty. And, this was clearly the right thing for her. There was another young woman who had kind of her doubts about her gender coincided with other psychological troubles, and she had started puberty blockers and then started testosterone, but later decided that she wasn't actually male and that this had been kind of a grievous mistake and that she feels like the process had been too rushed. There was a 3rd child who developed significant bone density issues and ended up going off puberty blockers for those reasons. And now,
Let's give Michelle 1 moment to finish.
Oh, sorry, I don't understand what you're. I just want to say very quickly, who else has an incentive to do a story about all the complications and the things that we don't know?
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. We're going to give the last word in this debate to Matt Taibbi. Matt, take us home.
First of all, just quickly, the notion that the New York Times should be patted on the back for doing this story like the Hunter Biden story years late, after all the people who had touched that subject were ostracized and in some cases actually thrown out of the mainstream media. They're working on podcasts now as opposed to working for big magazines like they had before. Douglas was writing about this years ago.
So was I. I first wrote about this for the New Yorker in 2014.
Not the New York Times.
not well. Anyway, it's like I think it's a little odd to give yourself credit for a story.
I'm not giving, I didn't write it. I'm not giving myself credit.
All right, fine. Look, tonight we talked a lot about whether or not you should trust the mainstream media, but for the business, there's a more urgent question, which is, do people trust the mainstream media? And we already have an answer. This is the headline from a recent Gallup Trusted Media survey. Americans' trust in media remains near record low. Washington, D.C. Dateline. At 34%, Americans trust in mass media to report the news, quote, fully, accurately, and fairly, is essentially unchanged from last year and just 2 points higher than the lowest that Gallup has recorded in 2016 during the presidential campaign. Just 7% of Americans have a great deal of trust and confidence in media, and 27% have a fair amount. Meanwhile, 28% of US adults say they do not have much confidence, and 38% have none at all in newspapers, TV, and radio. Notably, this is the first time that the percentage of Americans with no trust at all in media is higher than the percentage with a great deal or a fair amount combined. So, whatever the reason, mainstream media has an enormous trust problem. And it's doing an ostrich act. It's pretending it's not happening. It's pretending that it's somebody else's fault. When you're a writer, when you're a journalist, and people don't trust you, it's always your fault. It's always a communication problem. You can look back. I remember covering the 2016 presidential campaign. The news media couldn't have gotten that story more wrong for longer. First, every single data journalist said with absolute certainty that Donald Trump would never be the Republican nominee. Nate Silver from 538.com said that Donald Trump would play in the NBA before he'd be the Republican nominee. Then they gave him no chance to win the general election. And after that happened, they should have looked inside and said, what did we get wrong? How did we miss this? Well, you missed it because you're living in a bubble and you're no longer in contact with the rest of America. And that's the problem with the media today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for those closing statements. Now we're now getting an opportunity to vote on a second time on our motion.
Don't you want to find out the results of how the audience changed?
I really could care less.
It's quite a shift.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here, let's save us 5 minutes. You just tell us what. How do
I don't remember the exact number, but I think so. It started off as like 52 to 48 for trusting, and it actually shifted to like 81%, 19 don't trust.
Damn.
I don't believe it. I just didn't. So many of those people totally didn't trust the media from the start. Okay, they were either like rigging the results or like I don't know, but I don't believe that many people had their minds changed by this debate.
I know. I was shocked. I mean, I was there. It's also like a pretty urban audience of like elitist Torontonians. So like, you know, I don't think it was actually like, I don't think there's that many reactionaries. So I was surprised. I think people were somehow persuaded by.
I don't know.
And maybe just Malcolm Gladwell, like maybe they were just put off by. Let's blame him.
Maybe I could believe that, like, you know, that like, there's like a third of the audience that like just couldn't bring themselves to agree with Malcolm Gladwell at the end of the debate. But I'm with Ethan. I mean, this is why I can't stand polls at the beginning and ends of debates, because it's like, it's just such a weird insult to the idea of persuasion. Like, this is just literally not how people change their minds. That like you hear something and 10 seconds later you're like, oh my God, I guess that's right.
But people at the beginning did say it was like 90% said that they were willing to change their mind, which I thought was total bullshit also.
Yeah, which is also amazing. Like, why would why is that even a figure that we're interested in? Like, it's like what people think. It's like, that doesn't tell us anything about whether they're actually open to changing their mind. I mean, like, who's going to say no to that? Like, I want to know who these 10% are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say, like, I thought that on Douglas's point, I thought it was amusing, you know, or his shitty little, like, you know, Malk comment. And I think people, he said that because earlier, I think Malcolm Gladwell said like Doug, and he was just like correcting me. He's like Douglas. I don't know if people caught that. It was kind of quiet, but But you know, the stuff he was saying, like I actually found myself agreeing with almost everything he said in his closing statement in a certain sense, like just the idea that like we're creating more echo chambers. Like I think that's bad. But the funny thing is like, I just don't think he practices any of the values that he's basing that claim on. Like he said something about like we shouldn't be playing with facts. It's like to glibly, you know, play with facts for ideological purposes. I feel like that's exactly what he does like all the time. That's exactly what he did in the debate a bunch of times.
Totally.
So like,
and he certainly does it. Like again, you read Matt McManus and Nathan Robinson's review of his book, The War on the West, How to Prevail in the Age of Unreason. They wrote a review of that for Current Affairs back in September, and like they really they really like nail him about like there's a section, I'm looking back through this like on like what he says about Edward Said, for example. There's like a long section where they're just like, did Douglas Murray actually read this guy? Right? It's just no, he 100% doesn't practice what he preaches there. But like, yeah, I mean, if you're gonna do sort of like, it's like a little platitudinous, but it's like, yeah, it's not wrong.
Well, he made that point too about like that the media needs to tell their audience things that they don't want to hear, which is also hilarious because I feel like all he does is say things that his audience wants to hear, like constantly.
Yeah,
totally.
There was like a very strange point at the end, where man, I can't remember who the last person who talked was. Is Taibbi to my sleep deprivation? Yeah, Taibbi. He made this point about how like, like 538 and like all these organizations incorrectly predicted the election. And then he's like, why? Oh, because, Nate Silver he's out of touch. He doesn't interact with the real world. It's like Nate Silver isn't drawing up these estimates just based on like his intuition. He's like aggregating polls.
He's also just inaccurate about what they said, right? Like, so he may have said the thing, like, I'm sure that he's not making up the quote from thin air about playing in the NBA or whatever. I'm sure that like there's probably some like he was probably on a talk show or something a year before, the Iowa caucus, and he like said something like that, like a sort of like a moment of just kind of like expressing his intuitive sense of things. But like also, but then like, but when Taibbi says, "Oh, Nate Silver," who by the way, fun fact, I knew very slightly in high school. We were on the East Lansing High School debate team together. But I remember like going over to his house once to like work on something for that. But
that's fascinating.
Yeah, for better or worse, right? But then but I also talk shit about him in my first book, and also in something I'd written for Counterpunch before that. It was like how Nate Silver runs political cover for Hillary Clinton or something. So seems like a good, seems like personally a good guy from what I can recall from high school. But I dislike him as a political pundit. But like all that said, Taibbi is just like flat out like being recklessly inaccurate in how he summarizes what Nate Silver said, because he said, like, he quoted that throwaway comment about the NBA or whatever, and then he said, and then they said he had no chance of winning the general election. It's like, no, he fucking did it. The 538 estimate just before the election said that Trump had a 1 out of 3 chance of winning.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to the point we were making earlier, which is like, I mean, at the time, if you looked at the polls, if you looked at the betting markets, like if you looked at any like useful indicator of who was going to win the election, it was indicating that Hillary Clinton was going to win like pretty heavily, so like it's weird to pin it on Nate Silver that he guessed it wrong when he was just kind of like going off of the best information that we had, which did kind of suggest what he said.
Yeah, and like actually, honestly, even looking back at exactly what happened, I mean, like, actually, even more so than the Russia-Ukraine example, like, I would actually regard this as like an objectively surprising thing that happened, as surprising things sometimes do, that like, because it's not like, it's not like, oh, Nate Silver stupidly said that Trump only had a 1 in 3 chance of winning, and then like the Trump like was swept into office by some kind of landslide, right? I mean, like Trump lost the popular vote, and he won the electoral vote by the skin of his teeth. I mean, like the slightest wind could have been different, in like the suburbs of Madison, Wisconsin, and he would have lost that election. Like in some ways, it's I mean, like Hillary Clinton could have like could have like condescended to make an appearance or two in Michigan, and like she totally would have won, the 2016 election. I mean, it was really like, it was a feat that she somehow managed to lose that election. Like that's like I don't know that anybody else could have done it. Like I still think, even in retrospect, that it's like not just I'm losing his name, but the mayor of Baltimore, who was briefly candidate in the 2016 primaries.
The mayoral candidate in the 2016 primaries.
He was the mayor of Baltimore.
No, he was the mayor of Baltimore, right? He was like in the first. He was like the third person in the first Bernie Hillary debate.
Man, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I feel Mandela effect here. Like, no, I swear to God, there's one person on the stage. And
there was a third one. Yeah.
Anyway, whoever that guy is, if
the character from The Wire, I like that comment.
Yeah, exactly. I actually think literally he was the person who the guy The Wire was based on. But anyway, whatever. Right? The guy from The Wire. Like I think would have won the 2016 election. Like it was so easy. Like Trump,
Martin O'Malley,
Martin O'Malley, thank you. Yes,
that's what it's in the chat. I don't take credit.
Yeah,
I do think one of the things that I was thinking of, and sort of like putting Michelle Goldberg and Matt Taibbi together. One of the things, and this goes back to why, like last time I was saying, Eileen, the don't trust the media thing. I'm hearing a feedback. Oh.
I think someone's got their speaker on, maybe.
There we go. Basically, like Michelle Goldberg's whole posture was like, well, we're all you've got. It's the only mainstream media you have. And this kind of like gatekeeping and rhetorical posturing strikes me as like really lacking a critical introspection. And then Matt Taibbi, for everything we've just been sort of squabbling about Nate Silver. What I took from his final remarks are there is a crisis of trust and confidence here, and we need to figure out like why exactly that is. And I think that's why I lean towards it's more productive to be more critical, to sort of uncover what exactly that is. Because when you look at some of the research on like what the public actually thinks about the media, you ask them how they think that the media is performing on certain values or factors, it's dismal. You also ask them what they think the media should be, and then you ask journalists, and the values are really, really different. And like no one ever seems to ever talk about this, because basically journalists do actually hate their publics. Like there really is a lack of critical introspection, and I heard that from both Gladwell and Goldberg. Whereas Matt Taibbi, the kind of like at least calling it like it is and saying like there's a crisis. So I don't necessarily think he has the right solution, but I think that's a productive stance.
Yeah, no, I could go along with that. I mean, I think that it's like a little bit, like the way he put it was a little bit odd. Like, it's like, well, if it's always your fault, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, it's like, well, is there like some sort of metaphysical guarantee of that? I don't know, right? But yeah, I mean, more charitably, I see your point, right? That it's like, look, there is this like crisis level distrust, and it's a little much to say that like, the actual practices of the media are like a totally innocent bystander in this drama, and that like this is not at all self-inflicted. So like, this is what my side of the debate is pushing. Like that's not a crazy way to wrap up.
Yeah, the other thing I thought about was like, I mean, some of the things that Michelle Goldberg said, I mean, she was a little like, she felt surprised it was her turn, first of all, and she kind of rambled a little bit. And I think, by the way, like the clapping that was happening there was because she was out of time. So like, that's why
which
people
they
started
said
clapping.
at the beginning of the debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody who goes overtime, please start clapping. And then she was like, I guess she just didn't remember that. I also agree, by the way, with something that our moderator Silver said in the chat, which was that like, even though like whether or not you think she was making a good point, like just tactically, it was probably a bad idea during your like 3 minute, was it supposed to be closing?
Yeah,
statement?
3 minutes
to spend
like tell a long anecdote.
To spend 90% of it on something that you're going to have to spend 90% of it explaining, right? You know,
I also don't agree that she needed to spend that much time on it. Like the story, I feel like was simple. It was just like a story that was covering trans issues. There's one person who like felt good about it. There's another person who didn't feel so good about it. And there's one person who had like health problems, and they covered that story. It's like, that's all you need to say.
You have to say that. You could just say they did a story on trans issues that you know,
maybe goes against like a liberal consensus about
it. Yeah, you could do a story on trans issues that like that some people perceived as anti-trans, although I think it's just because there was they were portraying a broader range of nuance to how people had reacted to hormone treatments or something like that. Like there was a way to do it in a sentence. She didn't have to like ramble on for like 90% of her closing about that specific story. Like, like she'd been so good just before that, right? Like they have a like the second to last time she talked was like, yeah, I agree with Gordon, what he said earlier. That was like actually probably like the best thing that anybody had said the entire debate, right? You know, and it was such a weird waste of a closing statement.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, on her point, I don't think it's like even though it was like extremely poorly executed, I mean, it's worth pointing out. And I think I kind of said this last week too, that the thing that is important about a mainstream media is that it can tell its audience something that like they don't necessarily like hearing, like whether you agree with the story or not. And I think like reporting on like people like children or people underage who are, you know, going through puberty blockers or whatever the story was about. I mean, that is a story that largely the audience of the New York Times probably doesn't agree with. And I think that's like could be a good thing. It is generally good to see stories that like you don't necessarily want to hear. Like at least it's like, to me, some kind of indirect evidence.
Sign that you're willing to tell your audience things they don't want to hear. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And fair, yeah.
Exactly. And I was even thinking about that today because I think today there's like, this was an opinion piece, but I think there's an opinion piece in the New York Times, like defending J.K. Rowling. And I was like, oh, wow, that's in the New York Times. Like, interesting. So insofar as like the main, like I do still feel kind of like at the beginning of the debate that with all the problems and all the great points that Taibbi brought in, I do feel that to some extent, like the mainstream media is still in the best position to offer us to tell stories that the audience doesn't want to hear.
I mean, there is a general point, like, I guess to sort of steel man that, like there is a sort of general thing that, like, institutions in general are good for that, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like I remember when I was on my big, road trip across the country to Mexico at the end of the year. I stopped in Austin. I was out having drinks with David Griscom and Robert Brown, and Griscom made this like nice point at some point in the evening about Christopher Hitchens. It was like, look, if Christopher Hitchens had to like subsist on Substack or whatever, then he might not have been able to do all this stuff, right? Because it's like, because even though obviously he'd like find his audience that liked like when he made these big shifts, the things that like he was now saying. It's like, yeah, like there is this sort of built-in incentive if you're just sort of, freelancing in a way where you're sort of very directly related to your audience to like just say what your audience wants to hear. Whereas like having those sort of institutional backings, like, like working for like the Nation or Vanity Fair, right? Like gives you a kind of shield for that. And so like, yeah, that's like an opinion example, but I mean, it's like roughly the same point, that like you have, that's like, yeah, there is definitely something to be said for like media institutions that could weather any particular storm as like good things to have.
Although in fairness, maybe it would have been a bit better if Hitchens did feel a little more scared to, make that shift.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, I mean, I think they're, I mean, I think it might have been like, you know, yeah, it might have been his good moral luck, you know, if he had to think about that a little bit more with some of the late cases. Although, you know, even there, like I think that some of the stuff happened in like the 90s, right? I mean, it's like I don't know. I mean, I don't think like when he was like actually, you know, like when he was like really savagely criticizing the Clintons from the left, you know, like I think like I don't think nation readers particularly wanted to hear that, like not nearly as much as you would think now, right? That like sort of with that now that the sort of soft left is like soured on that on the like on Clintonian liberalism much more, you know, much more than they had then. So it's like that might be an example where it was a good thing. And yes, some of the post 9/11 stuff might be an example where it's a really bad thing. And it would have been nice if it'd been cowed by some sort of left-wing conformity. So, so do we have, so Gordon, I think you're probably the person here who might have the sort of most kind of well-developed perspective on the sense in which we should or shouldn't trust mainstream media. So like as now we're sort of finally to the end of our cumulative total of 6 hours of talking about this debate. Like how are you feeling about it?
I don't know that the debate itself, at least the arguments that I've heard, have really contributed a whole lot. As we've been talking about, they sort of like bickered at each other for a lot of it. But I do think the one sort of takeaway that I especially have, well, especially of Gladwell, but also of Goldberg, is that for me, when an institution is seen in the eyes of the public as untrustworthy, there's probably something to it. And I think that the lack of critical introspection sort of like more broadly defines the way that like trust is discussed by liberals, trust of science, trust of government, trust of media, as like almost always some kind of pathology of the public. And then the only defense that we have is essentially like credentialized expertise, which we heard all through this debate. And I just think that's really counterproductive. Like, I don't think that's going to work on anybody. You need to tell them like why you're trustworthy. You need to be honest about your process. You need to be honest about how and why you're failing, which is why I thought the Goldberg point about like lack of diversity was such a good one. So yeah, I don't know, like the question itself is really broad. And if you have to pick one side, I mean, you can't really pick one side, but if you have to pick one side, again, I say don't trust, because I think that's just like got to be the kind of de facto kind of left position on a capitalist media, especially when it's increasingly concentrated. But what does trust mean? I mean, probably something more like healthy skepticism, I guess. Yeah, that's kind of where I come out on it. But I think it is a problem. And I think a lot of people sort of don't seem to think it's a problem, that we have this like crisis of legitimacy in elite institutions. And the trust side wasn't bothered by it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think I broadly agree with you. I think I broadly agree with all of your outcome, but I think I still lean a little bit on the side of trust. So it's just like interesting, because I feel like maybe I'm just interpreting the facts or weighting different things. I completely agree that like leftist perspectives should have a kind of skepticism of institutions with power. But I also think I also take that almost as like a weird, if you're like serious about leftist politics, almost like a trivial truth. Like we should be skeptical of institutions. And it's like, we should always do that. Anything that concentrates power, we should kind of worry about. But still, I feel that like the alternative, I think I worry more about the alternative of the standpoint of not trusting more than you do, Gordon.
Well, let me put it this way, Victor. What if I asked you, do you trust the government?
I probably, yeah, that's tough. That's tough. I probably not, but I have trust in the institutions, at least in a Canadian context, for the most part. I mean, And when I say trust in the institutions, I mean that like they work for the most part. There's a bunch of problems that you could hone in on, but and there's actually really interesting literature about trust in institutions and like how that creates new possibilities for kind of like emancipatory potential for like leftist politics, that like when you don't have institutions that there's like any trust in, it's really hard to take power and make change for the better. And I think I forget what it was, but someone wrote about like the problem with like the Latin American Marxist and socialist movements is that like no one has trust in the institutions there. So even when they win, it's like there's very little way of like creating meaningful reform and change. So like I think this question of trusting institutions beyond the media is like a really important one, and I feel like even I think my leftist politics might be more worried about that in general, like not just in the sphere of the media, like the importance of institutions that we can broadly trust. I think it's like a really important foundation for having a kind of functional legitimacy in any society.
I mean, insofar as I'm following the point there, I mean, that seems compatible. Like you could say, like, it's really important to build institutions that people trust, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should trust any old institutions that happen to be available to you.
Yes, totally. And I think like, that's where I still think I agree with Gordon, right? That like we should always be like skeptical. We should have a healthy skepticism. So maybe, I don't know, it's like a kind of emphasis disagreement rather than factual disagreement or something.
Yeah. I mean, like Gordon said, I mean, it's clearly gonna have to be like any like plausible answer. Like yes, I mean, sure, gun to the head, I have to pick yes or no to this incredibly vague, weirdly formulated question. I'll say no, you shouldn't. But like also obviously the answer is it depends what you mean and in what context. Yeah. And to what degree, right? Like I don't
depends on what you mean by do you trust.
Yeah, man. So sometimes you got Jordan Peterson something you're right to do it. Yeah, I think that because it's like, yeah, I think like broadly speaking in most contexts, like if the question is like if you see an article in the New York Times, should you think that thing probably happened? Then it's like, yes, you should, right? I also think that depending on what kind of claim they're making, like there are like whole spheres of exceptions to that where, you should be like, maybe, right? Like how much evidence am I actually seeing in this article, et cetera. And, and you should certainly not trust them to have like, be guided in their selection of stories and, to like emphasize and talk about by the principles I would like them to be and, have reasonable takes on their op-ed pages and, like all sorts of other things like that, right? Like that there are many important respects in which you should distrust it, that like, you don't, because it's like, yeah, there is a sort of like, I mean, it's frustrating, I think, having it be a four-way debate. Doesn't help either because like I mean part of the reason that I think it would have actually been more interested if it had just been Taibbi versus Goldberg is that in some ways I think they actually share a lot of premises, but they're just drawing very different conclusions.
They seemed like the only two honest actors, honestly.
The other two were totally like kind of rhetorical. They were kind of sophists, the other two in a way.
Yeah, they were like it's like the other two were like the guy who's on like the hockey team just like strictly just to get into fights.
Exactly. Totally.
And yeah, like so it's like, I mean, given that you agree about a lot of the sort of economic stuff that's that's going on in mainstream media, like how should you think about it in relation to this question? And I mean, like it's because it's sort of like because it was so all over the place, it's like everything. It's almost like, you should only believe things that contrarian journalists on Substack tell you, versus like the New York Times' coverage of Russiagate was flawless.
Yeah, I know, and like honestly, that's something that I think I worry about a lot too, and this might be also motivating my emphasis. it's just the amount of fucking people. Maybe I just spend too much time on Twitter and kind of like perusing the YouTube media sphere, but it's like the amount of fucking people online whose entire like contribution to the discourse is adopting an ever more like edgy, like anti-establishment, like anything that's anti-establishment, they accept. It just seems to be like more and more common, at least from my perspective, and I worry about that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. I mean, you know, it's not been emphasized enough. Like, to say there's no alternative is, I find, unsatisfying, but like there's a lot of truth to that. Like this comment here from Yoda, like trust them to make your grind your teeth but come back tomorrow morning, is like, it is how we live our lives. And it is like, it is the same thing for government, for public health, for scientists, for all these like complex systems in modernity that we can't actually like, you know from top to bottom to verify their every claim. We have to just kind of make this leap of faith and have a kind of position of basically de facto trust, and at least like trust that the claims are real, because it's going to drive us crazy if we can't.
Yeah, I believe that Yoda's reference about grinding the teeth is a callback to a story that I've always loved, and I've probably told a couple times on the this channel, which you guys probably all know this, the Noam Chomsky at the dentist.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Actually.
It's so good.
Yeah. So this is, you can find YouTube videos of both Christopher Hitchens and Gore Vidal telling the story. But supposedly Noam Chomsky like is at the dentist, and the dentist is asks him, do you grind your teeth? Like, you seem to grind your teeth, and and he's like, I don't think so. Right. And then he like asks like Mrs. Chomsky, does your husband grind his teeth? I don't think so. Right. Or does he do it at night? And she's like, no, I haven't seen Noam, grinding his teeth at night. And they can't figure it out until like the next day she puts it together, which is that because she's usually like in the other room or whatever while he's reading. So it's that he grinds his teeth while he reads the New York Times in the morning.
Right. I think you did. I do remember you might have actually said this last, but I forgot. Yeah, that's funny. That's really funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that we all agree that you should only believe things that you hear on Newsmax, O&M,
Tim Pool.
Tim Pool, and
especially
and Infowars. Those are the four places that you should get your news.
Yeah, exactly.
When they disagree, just like flip a coin, roll a 4-sided die. Yeah.
The post game on Monday, we watched some amazing Tim Pool clips about like his like literally. There's one of them where, I mean, to be fair, this one wasn't Tim, this was his guest, but nobody contradicts him. Where like somebody asks, like, so would you say that Plato was the founder of the Illuminati? And the guy in the most like chill way is like, yeah, ultimately. Good stuff. Oh man. Oh, okay. Well, that sounds like a meeting of the minds that I don't even want to contemplate. But in any case, good stuff. So why don't we just go around real quick and where can Ethan, where can people find you when you're not on here?
You can find me on my YouTube channel, now titled Confronting Capital, or my website, also titled Confronting Capital. Full disclosure, you cannot read anything on my website unless you are a patron. So, that's one caveat. My less dignified Twitter is Mouthy Infidel. You can find me there.
For extremely edgelord takes.
Yeah.
I'm Victor. You can find me on Plastic Pills Podcast, which you can find on YouTube and anywhere you get podcasts. And soon you'll be able to find the three of us on probably what's going to be called the Academic Edgelords Podcast with Matt McManus as well. So watch out for that eventually. Hopefully in the next like month or two, we can have some episodes ready for consumption.
Yeah. You can find me on Darts and Letters, which is a podcast that I host. We've got a very cool story next week about a hippie school in Toronto that sort of went sour, although we kind of talk more about
In the
complicated
60s, right?
Yeah, exactly. Rochdale. Canadians will know.
A 60s communist experiment that went wrong.
And on Twitter at Gordon Katic.
Very nice. So on this show on Monday, we're going to play my full debate with libertarian think tanker John Miltimore at the Texas Tech Law School, which happened a little over a week ago, and we're going to unlock that, and we're also going to have R.M. Brown and Anna Kasparian. Should be a good episode. So that's coming up on Monday night. Check all those people out and all the stuff they just said. Left is best.